Viana Asa Eliant, born the legitimate heir of the Marquis, she invariably found herself at the center of events wherever she went. Even at the height of her success, she took everything for granted, as if the whole world lay at her feet. But that picture was just a mirage created by her dreams. She was just a stupid woman. For some reason, she strove for love. For some reason, she desired something that never belonged to her. She had everything, but for some reason, she always craved more. But while she was on stage, someone was watching her from the audience. All she had to do was get rid of her ill-wishers. The light fell on her face, on her curly blonde locks. The other girl, dark-haired and brown-eyed, watched with wide eyes as the words were spoken, the command not to forget. "I am you," it sounded, and a drop of blood ran down the golden-haired girl's chin. The sharp shard in which the girl who was looking was reflected was also stained with this blood. The sky above the house with white walls and large windows was light, although covered with clouds. The bird that was sitting on a branch in front of one of the windows was singing. The girl lying on the bed stretched out her hand towards the sunlight pouring through the window. "Ah," she said, looking at her own hand and the ceiling of the room. She sat up in bed. Everything around her was so familiar, but at the same time alien to her. She slipped her feet into her slippers to stand up. This room was exactly like in her memories. The girl looked again at the window from which golden light was pouring. She walked up to the mirror and looked at her reflection. Yes, this face was well known to her. She saw the bloody lips of Viana Asa Eliant in front of her. "Don't forget I am you," repeated the ghost of this girl, who appeared between her, dark-haired and brown-eyed, and the mirror. But in the reflection, she looked completely different. She thought that maybe she had become the reincarnation of the deceased Viana. Or she remained Li Jia, the one who really wanted to change her boring life. Maybe she was a young Vienna who saw her own future. The girl touched the smooth surface of the mirror again. She thought that it could all just be a dream, in which it was clear that she was Viana Asa Eliant, who died cursing this world, and she was also Li Jia, who lived her ordinary life in a past incarnation. And now she was Viona again and stood in front of the mirror. It was a strange feeling when you keep memories of two past lives at once. "Oh God!" came from the door, which suddenly opened. A frightened maid stood at the threshold and exclaimed that she did not know that the miss had already woken up. The maid bowed low and said that she would immediately bring water for washing. She ran away without giving the lady a chance to say a word, and it looked like she was scared. Given Viana's character, this was not particularly surprising. Warm water for washing, a carefully chosen dress and jewelry, all this had to be ready before she woke up, before the slightest mistake was capable of upsetting her for the whole day. At least, that was the case until yesterday, the girl thought, watching the maid fussing about. "I beg your pardon," said the maid, bowing as she handed her the basin. The girl asked what the maid's name was. The maid turned around, clearly even more frightened than before. Viana repeated that she wanted to know her name. It seems the maid did not expect such a question at all. From her rough hands and skin, it was obvious that she was only a low-ranking servant, and it was unclear why Viona was being courted not by a maid, but by a simple girl. The maid finally answered that her name was Marie, and Vion asked why she was there. Since there was no place for someone like her in the chambers of the Marquise's only daughter, the maid muttered something about a nanny. She muttered that she had done wrong and began to beg the miss for mercy. The girl thought that the maid was very lucky. Yesterday she would not have listened to excuses, but today she asked what was going on with the nanny, whether she had sent her here. "Yes," replied the maid, falling to her knees before her mistress. She replied that she really didn't know why she was given such an order. Viana watched the maid with her arms crossed. She cried and could not explain anything else. Then Viana told her to get out of here. She said that the maid could not serve her like that. Viana thought she sounded like she was rejecting the servant because of her low status, but that wasn't quite true. She told the girl to drink a glass of water to calm down. Viana said the maid looked like she was about to faint. She told the maid to tilt the glass and drink water from the opposite end to stop the hiccups. Viana was sitting on the bed. The maid was still on the floor, kneeling. Viana wondered if she really needed to explain such obvious things. Then she told the maid to go out and call her another maid. "Now," the girl exclaimed and ran out of the room to carry out the assignment. Viana thought that the maid was too stupid. She wondered what she had done to her, who Viana had been yesterday. Soon, 2 other girls appeared on the threshold, ready to serve her. They bowed and said that they would help the miss get ready, and Viana thought that the nanny knew her character very well, so it was completely unclear why she sent such an inexperienced girl. No, most likely she was just busy with something too urgent. The urgent matter made the nanny forget that Marie was a simple, low-ranking servant. Viana asked the girls who had now arrived where the nanny herself was, and they answered that she was in the mistress's chambers. Viana thought it was strange, because she rarely went to the Marquise openly. The old Viana would have taken her anger out on the servants, but the current one simply walked away, the maids asking where she was going. The nanny was the only person who took care of Vian when she was little, and her former selfishness did not allow her to tolerate the thought that the nanny put the Marquise above herself. But now completely different thoughts came to her mind in this situation. For some reason, all this now seemed like just a childish farce. The agitated maids followed her through the corridors of the mansion, trying to call out to her from behind and not let her through certain doors. Viana thought she knew it. She stopped near one of the doors. Viana demanded that this door be opened for her immediately. The maids replied that now might not be the best time for this, but knowing in advance what a miserable future awaited her, Viana had to live right and change her destiny. It had never occurred to her before, but now she suddenly understood a lot. Viana resolutely pushed away the maids who tried to detain her. She opened the door and entered the room, as she needed to see the marquise. In that room there was a tall, black-haired man, a red-haired woman with a face distorted with anger, who was being held by the shoulders by that same nanny. Viana ran through the open doors. So, she thought, seeing that everyone was already gathered here. "Well then, I'll go," said the man and headed towards the exit. "Don't you dare!" the red-haired woman screamed furiously. The nanny held her by the shoulders, ignoring the growling she was making. Viana thought the man didn't even turn around. Now that she looked more closely, the marquise looked eerily like Viana in her last moments, dying, full of hatred for the whole world. The only daughter of a wealthy count's family, at the age of 18 she married the Marquis of Eliant and became his marchioness. For years she chased him, trying to win his love, and it became such a big story that it is still discussed by all of high society. She spared nothing, neither money nor connections, just to win just a grain of his attention, but the Marquis was colder than an iceberg. He not only kept his distance, he avoided even the slightest touch. No one really understood why he married her. There were rumors that it was only because of her solid dowry. Over the years, her melancholy only grew stronger in desperation. She even tried to give birth to an heir, undermining her health. But in the end, a daughter, even if her own, had no value, since she could not inherit the title. The red-haired marquise screamed that it was Viana's fault, because if she had been born a boy, everything would have been different. Viana wondered if it would have made any difference. After all, the marquis didn't pay attention to her, not because she was a girl, he simply didn't care about either of them. But it was already useless to explain anything to the marquise. She was too mired in her own delusions. "Ah!" she screamed, repeating that all this was only because of Viana, that only she was to blame for everything. "Die, perish, and finally die!" cried the marquise, rushing towards the girl with an outstretched hand. The nanny held her back, trying to persuade her to calm down, and yet the marquise managed to escape from this grip. She rushed towards the girl with hatred, reaching out to grab her. Viana froze before this sudden attack. The marquise really tried to finish her off. The girl did not wait for the mad marquise to catch her and tried to run away. Viana ran to the door to knock on it with her fists and leave this room. She couldn't handle the mad woman one-on-one, so she ran out and closed the door behind her. She couldn't hold it, but she thought she could lock it with a latch. She asked the people standing in the corridor not to stand there like pillars, but to help her. One of the men had a sword at his belt, and Viana told him to hook the sword onto the handle to hold the door so that the marquise could not escape. They did so, and such a bolt really did hold back the blows that rained down on the door from that side. The servants of the mansion gathered around Viana, worried about what was happening. Judging by the sounds of nails scratching at the door, no matter how hard Viana tried, she couldn't remember the marquise behaving so madly. She thought it really was the marchioness. "Well," she said, "good luck to you." Leaving the servants at the door, Viana resolutely walked away. The maids tried to catch up with her, but the girl moved quickly. In her entire life, she had never seen the marquis enter his wife's chambers. He even posted knights at his doors to prevent her from breaking into his bedroom or study without permission. It was completely incomprehensible how Viana could have been born in such a case. She had the face of a marchioness, but not a single feature of her supposed father. She looked through all her relatives, and no one had such golden brown hair. Whether she was this man's daughter at all, Viana didn't know. But the marquise was completely obsessed with this man. It is unlikely that she would cheat on him. She thought about simply asking him about everything directly. The guards who stood at the door said that the miss was not allowed to go in there. In fact, it made no difference whether Viana was his daughter or not. She had already screwed up once anyway, so she had nothing to lose. The guards asked Viana what brought her here. Viana replied that she had come to see the marquis, or rather, to see her father. They tried to detain her, but the girl told them to step aside and open the door. The marquis was sitting at the table and his assistant had just brought him tea. "Miss, you have arrived," said the assistant. The marquis, as Viana noticed, remained cold as always. Without even raising an eyebrow, the girl did not understand what the marquis saw in him at all. The assistant asked Viana if she would like some tea. The girl replied that she didn't want any. Viana moved as close to the table as she could to look into the marquis's face. She asked him directly if she was really his daughter, and all the servants watched what was happening with excitement. The marquis continued writing the document as if he had heard nothing, but he still looked at the girl and asked why she was talking about this. Viana replied that it was exactly what she was asking about. The marquis asked if it mattered. Viana replied that it didn't really. The marquis said that then she should not waste his time. Viana replied that it was not particularly important to her personally. Then the girl added that if she was going to get to the top, such little things could become a problem. The Marquis looked at her and asked if she was now aiming to become empress. A collective sigh came from behind Viana, and she belatedly thought that she should have closed the door on these curious people. Viana asked what would change if she said yes now. The Marquis replied that she was wasting her time on nonsense. Viana noticed that the rumors of blood relationship were a dagger that could stab her in the back at any moment. Once she became an empress, these gossips hung over her like a guillotine. The Marquis never refuted them, his silence held them back. But not enough. The wolves of high society still tore her apart, as if slashing her with invisible blades. So now she needed to know the truth more than ever. She was not so stupid as to jump into the fire with a bundle of brushwood in her hands. So Viana insisted that the Marquis tell her. She wanted to know if she was truly a legitimate daughter of House Eliant, so she stood in front of the Marquis and asked him this. The Marquis's gaze stopped on the girl. He didn't think the question was even worth answering. The question the girl thought was important wasn't even worth an answer. Viana thought that now everything became clear to her. The Marquis was not silent at all, at least in this matter he was always honest with her. He never doubted for a moment that Viana was his daughter, he just didn't need to prove anything to her or to the whole world. He had always been a man of few words and restrained, and Viana, like everyone else, came up with her own doubts and interpreted everything as she wanted. It turns out that all this time Viana was tormented by an illusion born of her own inferiority complex. The Marquis said that if Viana was going to continue talking nonsense, it would be better for her to leave. But now, after this conversation, the girl finally understood everything. Without a shadow of a doubt, she was his biological daughter. When the girl smiled, the Marquis looked at her in surprise. Viana thought she had laughed too loudly. But it turns out that this man did have feelings after all. Viana said that the Marquis asked her if she wanted to become empress. After all, there was not yet an unmarried woman in the empire who did not dream of this title. Viana also dreamed of the crown, dreamed of standing next to the emperor, of feeling this pride in her chest. She believed that once she got the throne, they would live happily, like in a fairy tale. But even knowing in advance about her unhappy future, whether she wanted to achieve this goal, whether she should obediently follow fate, as if everything was already predetermined, Viana did not know. What she really wanted, now that there was more than one personality in her, was unclear to herself. The Marquis asked if Viana wanted the same. She was so sure that she wanted power, but the throne was not a toy that could be obtained simply by desire. This path was a web woven from blood, lies, and 1,000 threads of other people's interests. In other words, even if Viana refused, she would not be able to avoid it. Viana said that her wishes never mattered. "You," said the Marquis, but did not have time to finish the sentence. Viana turned around, wanting to know who had come. Perhaps the Marquis had sent someone to follow her. It was the butler, but he would never have burst in so unceremoniously, as if he had lost his composure. The Marquis asked what was going on, and the butler bowed low before him and asked for forgiveness. He wanted to tell something about the lady. Ah, thought Viana, now she remembers. After all, this was not the first time she saw the butler like this. That day was exactly the same as today. When Viana woke up, her nanny was not there. Hearing that she had been urgently summoned to the Marquis, she became furious. Afterwards, she hit the maid when she stuttered, trying to explain the situation. The anger did not subside, and Viana threw everything that came to hand. No one dared to stop the girl that day. Only later, after a long time, the butler came. He was just as confused as now. His movements, always calm, were then abrupt and hasty, and he, just as now, could not utter a word. Viana didn't even understand how she could forget all this. She already knew what the butler was going to say. He announced that the lady had died. It was a clear, sunny, and warm day. The weather was too nice for a funeral. Viana thought about this as she walked out of the mansion, dressed in a black mourning dress. According to tradition, the Marquis's body was to be cremated and placed in the Eliant family crypt. The ceremony will take place after everyone has left the funeral site. Only immediate relatives may attend. Until the body is consigned to the flames, it will be possible to say goodbye to it. Many of the guests could not comprehend that the Marquis had died so suddenly. They hoped that since they were here to say goodbye, perhaps they would be told the reason for such a sudden death. But the Marquis didn't explain anything, which could mean that it wasn't an illness. If the Marquis had been ill, everyone would have already known about it. In any case, many were curious, wanted to know how such a beautiful woman was prepared for the funeral ceremony. Some were simply impatient to look at her. Viana thought it was some kind of vulgarity, when funerals were akin to a spectacle for people. She even wanted to know how many were here who were sincerely grieving. The girl looked closely at the Marquis. It looks like they were about to open the coffin. The Marquis placed a yellow flower on the white lid of the coffin. The lid had not even been lifted yet. To break the funeral tradition would have been the same as depriving the Marquise of her last honors. But the Marquis left the coffin without a word. No prayer, no farewell speech. He was truly heartless. Everyone understood that the rumors were indeed true. The Marquis behaved as society expected of him. He was exactly like that. Viana realized that just as these people misunderstood his behavior, she had once been wrong about him. People whispered that Lady Eliant was really who they were talking about. They were worried that Viana would hear them, but they did nothing to lower their voices, and the girl heard literally every word. Last time, Viana did not know anything yet, and could not stand his coldness, whispers behind his back and looks full of pity. In a rage, she ran out of the funeral hall. The Marquis did not even try to stop her. If she left now, he would have behaved in exactly the same way. But now that she understood his motives, Viana had no desire to make a scene. The Marquise committed suicide. While the maids were distracted, she jumped out of the window of her room. The room was on the 3rd floor, and if it was an ordinary 3rd floor, like in Li Jia's world, then everything would have been fine. But in the Marquise estate, all the ceilings were especially high. At almost all funerals, the body is laid out for viewing, with the exception of those whose death was caused by a contagious disease, or if the body was so disfigured that it is impossible to look at it. But even in this case, people are warned in advance. But in this empire, suicide was taboo. Such people are not seen off on their final journey, and no prayers are offered for their repose. From now on, official records will state that it was death from disease. So Viana drew conclusions from what was happening. She came up and placed the flower on the lid of the coffin. Like the Marquis, she had to show respect, even if she was not pure in the eyes of other people, even if she was never a worthy mother to Viana. The Marquis looked at the girl or at someone behind her. She was standing next to him, but now someone else approached them. Viana didn't immediately understand who this man was, but then she recognized the magnate Count Pison. He was her maternal grandfather, and since he was the Marquise's father, of course he was present at the funeral, but Viana had completely forgotten about it. He also placed a yellow flower on the coffin lid. The Count bent over the coffin so low he fell to his knees. How hard it was for him to let go of his daughter, whom he had raised and cherished so much. Just looking at him made my heart clench. Viana watched as the Count rose with difficulty from his knees. His eyes seemed to be glazed over, and he stared straight ahead with a fixed gaze. The Count stumbled and began to fall, waving his arms. Viana looked at him with fear. The girl realized that the Count was about to fall and hit his head. Some man rushed to the Count's aid and managed to support him. He asked if the Count was okay. Viana, who had been watching this scene with fascination, thought that it was a blessing that someone had managed to catch the Count. Judging by how friendly the Count was towards this man, he was clearly dear to him. The young man led the Count away, allowing him to lean on his shoulder. He himself turned around and looked at Viana, who was still frozen in front of this scene. The girl did not understand why he looked at her with such hostility. Or maybe she just imagined this attitude in his eyes. But no, most likely she didn't imagine it. She thought it could have been a challenge. Perhaps he thought that Viana was scared. She also stared at him so that he wouldn't think that only he could do that. He paid no attention to the girl's indignant look. Viana hoped he would say something to her, but he just left. Viana thought it was very awkward that such a trifle could throw her off balance so quickly. And yet one thing did not give the girl peace. For some reason, this young man's face seemed very familiar to her. The funeral of the Marquise lasted 3 days. On the last day in the crematorium, where only the closest relatives were allowed, it was time to commit her body to the flames. The white coffin burst into flames, rising high in the air. Viana looked at the fire and thought that she had once so longed for this woman's love. She pretended to be obedient and even tried to adopt some boyish habits, but this only angered the Marquise even more. She was always interested only in the Marquise's attention. Viana wondered if she had been even a little more like the Marquis, perhaps his wife would have treated her a little better. But even if the girl had asked about this, no one would have been able to hear her answer. And now that the Marquis has become a widower, they will begin to persistently propose brides to him, because his only child was a daughter who was not capable of inheriting the title. Wait, Viana suddenly thought. She remembered that until her last death, the Marquis had never married again. Now she began to think that perhaps the Marquise was closer to him than she had previously thought. She would like to believe it. Because perhaps she too would like to be consoled by the thought that the one she loved did not hate her. All that was left of the Marquise was a handful of ashes, which were placed in a special burial urn. The Marquis took it in his hands and handed it to Viana, telling her to take it. He took out a sharp knife and cut off a lock of hair. Then he cut off a lock of hair from Viana herself in the same way. This was the last rite. A lock of hair of the closest relative was also lowered into the burial urn. This was a symbol that the connection between them is not broken even after death. To complete the tradition, Count Pisone's hair was still needed, but now he was too shocked for that. "It seems I wasn't late after all," said the voice of a woman who approached them and said that since she was not part of the immediate family, she was not allowed in and was waiting here. She said that the Marquis had no idea how worried she was that she might not make it in time, and while she was talking, Viana remembered that she had almost forgotten her, since she had only seen her a few times. It was Countess Pison, the Count's second wife, and therefore formerly Vian's grandmother, but she never considered her as such. It was the first time Viana had seen the Countess so close last time she had run away from the funeral on the very first day, so there had been no opportunity to meet. Besides, she was from a common class, and there was no blood connection between them, so there was no reason for communication, and now the Countess said that she would like to convey something. She held out a small bag containing a lock of hair and said that she had been afraid that he would be upset if she asked him about it, so she had allowed herself this tactlessness. The Marquis took the bag from her hands. A strand of dark hair fell into the urn, adding to the ashes. The Marquis said he did not know how to thank the Countess, but she replied that she had only done what she had to. The Marquis turned to leave. Viana followed him, and the Countess looked after them. "Young lady," she said. The Countess asked if Viana would like to visit the Count. The Countess said that he really wanted to see Viana. These words greatly surprised the girl. The Count almost never visits the capital, and after the Marquise fell ill, he did not appear at all. Viana just didn't understand why he suddenly wanted to see her. The Countess explained that Viana was his only blood relative. She really was the only one. The last time, shortly after the death of the Marquise, the Count also died, unable to survive the shock. Although Vianney received part of the inheritance, the main fortune went to Countess Pisson. This fortune was so enormous that it gave rise to many rumors. People whispered that the simpleton killed the Count for money. Vian's nanny kept telling her this day after day, so that she would also accuse the Countess, and she was so fed up with it that without really thinking it through, she too easily testified against her. Because of this, the Countess had a miscarriage right during the interrogation. The loss of that child was entirely Viana's fault. But now she has clarified that she is no longer the Count's only blood relative. The Countess looked at her as if she took these words as an insult. She wished she would just accept it. It wasn't like Viana, but she sincerely hoped that this time the child in the Countess's womb would survive. The Countess said that it seemed that Viana was mistaken. She was still his only blood relative. Then it turned out that this child was not Count Pissone's. Viana asked about this directly, pointing her finger at the Countess's stomach. The Countess declared that the young lady was overstepping her bounds. If Viana remembered correctly, the Count would die in 2 months and the Countess would lose her child during the investigation, which could mean that she simply didn't know she was pregnant yet. Viana said that excessive excitement could harm the child, causing the Countess's indignation. Viana said that it was up to the Countess to decide whether to believe her or not, but if she wanted to keep the child, she had to take care of herself. Then the girl added that it would be better to tell the Count, if, of course, it was his child. The Countess clenched her fists, trying to contain the emotions that were overwhelming her. She said he was not a Count, he was Viana's maternal grandfather. Viana was surprised that it was worse than if she had doubted her origins. For some reason, this woman got angry at the way she called the Count. Viana said that how she addressed people was her personal business. The Countess said hesitantly that for some reason everything, for some reason always, but she was unable to finish the sentence. Viana asked if she was talking about her and the Marquis, but the Countess again did not understand why the girl called everyone by their titles. Viana turned away from her and said that now her family were just strangers to her. When she died last time, her mother and father were everything to her. She lived for their attention. But after living Ligia's life and experiencing true parental love, she realized that blood relationship does not mean soulmate. "Let me leave it at that," she said, for it was already late. The girl headed towards the carriage where they were already waiting for her. "This is your mother's father," the Countess shouted after her. The Countess asked if Viana really didn't want to see him. The girl got into the carriage and the Countess remained standing and watching. At this time, the Marquis's mansion was filled with sobs. The nanny read about her poor girl, to whom even her mistress was so cold that she could not cope alone now, and Viana thought that the nanny was acting out the drama as if the end of the world had already come. But Viana had coped well even during the life of the Marquise. She was tired. She didn't understand what the servants were even thinking about, putting on such a show in front of her. Right after the funeral, in front of the child, the nanny should have stopped her tears. Otherwise, in such a state, she herself could have gotten sick. She had to be strong, because if she lost heart, who would support the young lady? It was already beyond the bounds of reason. The maid was wailing that she needed to pull herself together, calling her a poor thing, and Viana thought that they were wailing as if she were wailing over a corpse. Viana was very sleepy and didn't know when she would finally be able to rest. She was almost asleep when she heard a noise. Someone was being held at the door, but whoever came told them to move out of the way because she had to see Viana. "Step aside," said a familiar voice, but the servants replied that the lady did not wish to see anyone. The guest insisted that Viana herself should tell her about it, and the servants began to threaten to call the guards if she continued to persist. The guest asked if they wanted a fight. She reminded them that she was the lady's maternal grandmother, and therefore had every right to see her. The nanny asked her how dare she. Viana stood up and walked over to ask what was going on. The nanny replied that nothing significant had happened and that the lady should rest. Viana stepped forward and remarked that she was running into the Countess too often today. She told her not to stand at the threshold but to go inside, even though the nanny objected to this person. Viana asked how such words should be understood. "Madam," said the nanny, stepping back. For 8 years, Viana was an empress in her past life, and in order to maintain her dignity on the throne, she learned to humble those who contradicted her. For the nanny, this side of the young lady's character must have been new, so she was shocked. Viana told the nanny to leave if she still didn't calm down. The nanny tried to object. She asked how the mistress could treat her like that. "Hey, you two," she said. Viana ordered the other two maids to take the nanny away. She asked angrily if the nanny wanted to be dragged away from here by force. The nanny cried out, "How could she?" as the maids dragged her away. "Don't stand there, sit down, Countess," Viana said to her guest. They sat opposite each other at the tea table. The Countess sat very straight and looked straight at Viana. The girl clarified that the guest was unlikely to have come here without a reason. The Countess said that Viana was not what they said, but the girl knew that this was not at all what she wanted to say. The Countess asked if this woman was her nanny. She wanted to know what the young lady would do if the Countess accused this woman of insulting the nobility. Viana thought that this meant that the Countess would not back down, although she had foreseen this. She said she didn't like to beat around the bush, so she wanted her guest to be direct about what she wanted. And the Countess, as expected, began talking about her husband, the Count. She begged Viana to find time to see him. Viana didn't expect that her own nanny would be used against her. Now it has become really difficult to refuse. The Countess said that he was now in the guest wing. The Count lost consciousness during the funeral ceremony and woke up only recently. The Countess said that the first thing he asked was where Viana was. "You have come, my dear," said the Count with a smile. He asked the girl to come closer. Viana was surprised to see him like this, but she was convinced that the Countess did not kill the Count, and she did not need to do so. There was no hint of a thirst for life in his eyes. The Count took Viana by the hand and asked if she was all right, but the girl did not understand why she should not be. She and the Marquise had never been particularly close, and she had done nothing but hate her, but now all that was left was pity for the woman who had repeated her fate. Viana, like the Marquise, destroyed herself for the sake of love, and this was the reason for all the indulgence towards her. They were both blinded. Now Viana did not understand what was in this love at all, that she had once lost her mind and done stupid things. She didn't know what would happen now, whether she would be able to avoid these mistakes. Or maybe, when she met him again, Viana would take another wrong turn. She couldn't know that. "Forgive me," said the Count, hugging the girl. With tears in his eyes, he said that no matter how painful it was, he shouldn't have turned away. Now he believed that it was all his fault. He said that it was all his fault, called Viana his granddaughter, and asked her not to cry, to which the girl replied that she was not going to cry at all. But the Count's hands touched her face, wiping away the tears. He asked her not to cry so bitterly and silently. "I'll be back soon," he said later, when he said goodbye to her at his carriage. The Count said that he was repeating again that he was not leaving her at all. He insisted that Viana was not alone and asked her to remember that. He said that his departure was only a temporary measure. It was for Viana's sake. Then the Count entered the carriage and it drove away from the porch. A few days after the Count's departure, the nanny asked Viana with a smile what dress the lady would choose. Viana thought that maybe it was in vain that she let her go, although no, it was better this way than her hysterics because of that Countess. But this restless nanny is simply exhausting. However, it was she who raised Viana. The girl could not completely ignore her. "Madam, pull yourself together," said the nanny. She reminded that a visit to the imperial palace required much more preparation than the young lady thought. The nanny said that other young ladies were only invited to the palace after their coming-of-age ceremony, but Viana was given such an honor at such a young age. She was truly exceptional. But all these dresses were completely tasteless if they had had time. They could have ordered a dozen new ones. Finally, of all of them, the nanny found the most worthy one. She asked what the nanny thought about him, about her choice. The nanny said that, as expected, sky blue suited Viana very well, and the nanny suggested trying it on. Viana thought the dress was the color of the sky itself. The girl said that she did not want to wear it, which greatly surprised the nanny, who thought that the young lady adored this color. Viana replied that she now found him disgusting and ordered him to find her another outfit. "Okay," said the nanny, "I'll look some more." Sky blue was once Viana's favorite color. Now he became the most hateful to her. It drove Viana crazy. After she burst into tears in front of the Count, it became difficult for her to control her emotions. Even now, just thinking about the meeting, Viana was in such a state. She couldn't imagine what would happen when they saw each other. Was she going to fall in love with him again, so recklessly that she would be unable to resist the feeling at all? Viana wondered. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine if he would be so dazzlingly beautiful again. The nanny asked if the lady was not feeling well when she saw the look on Viana's face as she read the letter. The girl turned away and looked over her shoulder at the nanny. She put the envelope on the table and said that everything was fine. The nanny said that they had a lot of time for her hair and makeup, so she needed to try on the dress quickly. "Oh my God," said the nanny when all the preparations were completed. She said that the young lady looked stunning and that there was definitely no one in the empire more beautiful than her. Viana looked at her reflection in the mirror and thought that she, too, had once considered herself the most beautiful in the world. Now she understood that it was not that she was not beautiful, but she was certainly not the most beautiful in the entire empire. She knew the one who was truly called the Imperial Rose. She remembered well how she saw that girl next to her beloved man. She had bright, clear, sky-blue hair. She was beautiful and everyone's favorite pearl of the empire. The official reason for the invitation to the imperial palace was the emperor's condolences on the occasion of the death of the marquise, Vion's mother. But those who knew more understood that the reason was completely different. The emperor had one empress, 2 favorites, and countless concubines. They had more than 10 children, and he had 6 sons. But of the 6 princes, only 2 were the main contenders for the throne. The first prince was the son of the imperial mistress, and the 6th prince was the son of the late former empress, born more than 10 years ago. The 6th prince was declared heir immediately at birth, and that same year he lost his mother. The new empress was chosen from an impoverished baronial family, but she was never able to create a new power structure. All the nobility supported the first prince, the son of the eldest favorite. He was 16 years older than the heir, which put the latter at a distinct disadvantage, but the emperor placed his bets on the younger heir, chosen by him. And the first step in this game was once Viana, the Marquise Elian, from a family that had remained neutral for generations, was a desired ally for both the nobility and the emperor, but neither the nobility nor the emperor himself could influence her. So the emperor turned his attention to Viana and invited her to the palace. The visit to the palace was not a mere formality. The emperor simply needed a pretext to bring her here, and the death of the marquise became the perfect cover. No one could fail to understand the hint when the imperial carriage, the one that was only allowed to be used by members of the imperial family or those whom the emperor personally approved, was sent for Viana. So Viana found herself back in the wheel of fate. Viana wondered what would happen to her if she met him again. She was very afraid of this meeting. Or, more accurately, she was afraid of how she herself might change because of this meeting. The all-consuming love she once felt for him may make it difficult for her to maintain her composure. Viana was completely unsure of her own fortitude. The question of whether she, like others, dreamed of becoming an empress distracted the girl from the thoughts she had been immersed in. The Marquis asked this. Viana did not expect him to speak to her at all in her first life. When she first came to the palace, the Marquis did not say a word to her. Viana said that her wishes hardly mattered, but the Marquis objected that he would not have asked her about them if they had not mattered. Viana asked why the Marquis suddenly cared about her opinion. He had never done that before. The Marquis replied that it was because it concerned her. Viana didn't understand what had happened to him, where such a sudden change came from, because it had affected her then, in her past life. Even when she became crown princess and then empress, he never asked her about such things. Besides, she might not want it. Viana asked what would happen then. The Marquis asked whether this meant that she did not want to be empress. Viana asked if she said she didn't want to, would all this be possible to stop? The emperor had probably already decided that Viana would inherit the title, and unless something extraordinary happened, she would inevitably become it. He chooses her not because of love, but because of the influence that stands behind her. No matter what Viana wanted, the emperor simply had no more suitable match for the crown prince. He cannot refuse such a profitable alliance. Viana asked what would happen if she said she didn't want to become empress. Would she be able to avoid it then? Everyone understood that this would be difficult. Viana thought so it was completely pointless for the Marquis to ask her. The Marquis turned away and pretended to be fascinated by the view from the window. "We have arrived," he announced as the carriage drew level with the palace. Already, Viana thought excitedly, they were already at the palace. Following the Marquis, Viana got out of the carriage. The Marquis said it could be very difficult, and then he helped Viana out of the carriage and said that it was not at all impossible. Viana looked at him with wide eyes and could not understand what this could mean. Viana took the Marquis's hand and thought about these words. He said that it was not impossible, and perhaps this meant that they would fulfill her wish, or perhaps it hid a completely different meaning. She entered new and dangerous territory for herself. Viana couldn't understand what was on their minds. They approached the locked door. The servants reported to His Majesty that Marquis Eliant had arrived, and it was necessary to let the visitors in. Viana thought that this was the moment when she was here again. She stood in the throne room and looked at these walls of the imperial palace, illuminated by golden sunlight. In this throne room, destinies are decided. Viana thought that soon she would see him, for the first time in this life. They bowed before the emperor's throne, saying that the eldest daughter of House Eliant, Viana Ossa Eliant, and Gabriel Cruther Eliant, greeted the son of the empire. "Ha!" said the bearded man sitting on the throne. He said that as expected from the daughter of the great chancellor, the girl was all like her father. Viana tried to remember if the emperor had laughed as loudly then, but no, that time he had only smiled slightly, watching her awkward greeting, but now he was laughing completely sincerely. The emperor asked why the Marquis had hidden such a pearl from everyone until now, and the Marquis bowed and replied that it was a great honor for him. The emperor ordered Vian to come closer to him. The girl approached cautiously, her eyes meekly lowered. The emperor asked Vian how old she was, and she replied that she would soon be 11. The emperor declared that it was wonderful, simply perfect. Viana knew that the terms of her proposal were important to His Majesty. But for some reason he was even more glad to see her than the first time, and yet the girl was only greeting him. "Your Majesty, the Crown Prince has arrived," the call sounded. The Emperor said that was excellent. Let him come in immediately, and Viana thought that he was here. Viana wondered if she could look at him calmly, or if she would fall in love again so much that she would lose herself like last time, if it could happen that this time he would simply mean nothing to her. "Greetings, father," said the boy in the prince's uniform with a joyful smile. Viana noticed that he looked much younger than in her memories. This was because he was only 14 years old. But even now, that unearthly beauty that had once driven him crazy was noticeable in this boy. Viana took hold of the full skirt of her dress to curtsy. "The eldest daughter of House Eliant, Viana Asa Eliant, greets the future son of the Empire," she said. The prince looked at the girl carefully. The Emperor ordered the Crown Prince to come closer to him. He laughed and said that everything was as expected. Looking at the boy and girl standing next to each other, he said that he saw a completely ideal couple. He asked if the Chancellor thought the same. Then he turned to the Chamberlain and asked him what he thought about this, and he replied that they were like a pair of birds in the sky. Viana could not remember whether the Emperor's intentions had always been so straightforward. The girl had been too young then and had only noticed the prince, so some things had escaped her. The Chamberlain reminded His Majesty that the council was about to begin. The Emperor was surprised and said that he had lost track of time while talking to the young lady. It was an honor for Viana, but she realized that she had said nothing, only greeted. The Emperor said it would be a pity if the young lady left so soon. The Chamberlain noticed that there were reishi roses blooming in the garden of the wizard's palace, so it might be a good idea to show them to the young lady. Viana noticed that he nodded in a peculiar way and thought that the two had planned everything in advance. The Emperor said that it sounded delightful. The young lady would be more comfortable waiting for the Chancellor in the garden than returning alone, and Viana thought that she would be much more comfortable alone. Viana was not interested in the garden, but she could not disobey the Emperor. His Majesty watched the girl very carefully. She understood that there was an order hidden behind these words. The prince was ordered to accompany her while the Chancellor was busy. The Emperor instructed him to look after the young lady, and the prince bowed and agreed. "Young lady," said the prince, holding out his hand to her. The prince looked absolutely dazzling, as if in a golden glow. With a sigh, Viana extended her hand in response. Their hands touched, bringing back memories. Everything was exactly the same as then. The only difference was that this time Viana couldn't stop shaking with excitement, and now she was trembling with fear of what could happen to her again. The prince led her to the garden of the wizard's palace, also known as the Palace of the Crown Princess, although it has been empty for a long time recently. Viana followed the prince past the flowering bushes and thought that everything had been exactly the same then. The sky was clear and bright, and there was not a breath of wind. Viana felt as if fate itself was holding its breath, and suddenly a gust of wind blew up, lifting Viana's curls and swirling snow-white petals in the air. These petals matched perfectly with the prince's silver hair, and the prince touched Viana's golden lock of hair. Yes, this is exactly where it happened last time and in exactly the same way. At that very moment, Viana fell in love, terribly, irrevocably. Sirius Izan Lo Princeton was the crown prince of the Princeton Empire, the future emperor. Even after going through death, Viana could not forget him. He was the one for whom she rejected everything, even her destiny. Looking back now, Viana realized that he had never personally hated her. He was not openly tender with her, but he was not indifferent either. As a marquis raised as a crown prince, he knew better than anyone how to deal with people. With Viana, he was duly polite, and she took this politeness for a manifestation of warm feelings. At that time, she did not yet know what true love was. Not understanding the difference between politeness and feelings, she mistook his attitude for love. She realized her mistake when he met someone he truly loved. Viana saw how he behaved with his chosen one. It was in stark contrast to the way he treated everyone else. And if she had let him go as soon as she realized this bitter truth, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. But Viana simply refused to admit it, and she took her resentment out on her, the girl with blue hair. It was he, who at least treated her with the politeness befitting a husband, despite his lack of feelings, who mattered to Viana. And then he began to despise her. She looked for the reason in her rival, thinking that he had changed so much because of her influence. Although she didn't want to admit it then, she understood now. Long before their meeting, the prince had already looked at Viana with contempt. After that meeting, the nanny happily informed the girl that the palace had again sent flowers for the young lady. This happened almost every day. The nanny assumed that His Highness the Crown Prince must really have been deeply in love with Viana. But Viana now knew that this was not the case at all, that the nanny was wrong to think that these bouquets were sent by the Crown Prince, because they were from the palace. Such a gift simply could not be an ordinary sign of attention. Raisha was a flower that symbolized the Crown Princess. The prince would not have sent it. He most likely did not even know about these gifts. These were not gifts, but a warning from the Emperor that the Marquis Eliant's eldest daughter was already taken. Since she had rights of succession both to the house of the Marquis of Eliant and to the house of Count Pisong, she must have seemed a good match for any young nobleman. and since women could not inherit, her husband would receive the title. But the Count should have already appointed an heir in his past life. He appeared at about the same time. It would be nice to find out who he is, because in her past life, Viana was too infatuated with the prince to care. Still, she was glad that their first meeting went much more calmly than she expected. At one point, Viana's heart trembled, but she remained calm thanks to Ligia's consciousness, which helped her not to lose her head. She was able to remain sane and not go crazy. But it couldn't go on like this, Viana thought, and as soon as she froze, her thoughts returned again and again to the crown prince. The nurse asked what the young lady intended to do, and Viana replied that she was going out for a short walk. "Wow," she said, looking ahead. She stood on the threshold of what was supposed to be the garden of their estate. It was too obvious that the Marquise really didn't care about anything except her husband's attention. Viana thought there was a garden here, but it turned out to be a whole jungle. She stepped into the thicket of grass and threw her head back. This desolation and silence were charming in their own way. Even if the place had been abandoned, it was unlikely that there would be any wild animals here, Viana thought, and decided that perhaps she should just rest and enjoy the peace and solitude. Viana resolutely went deeper into the thicket of green bushes. She tried not to think about the prince, about that. Suddenly, a sound caught her attention, and she thought with excitement that it definitely couldn't be a bear, since she was still on the estate's territory. It was probably a cat, or a raccoon, or maybe a lost rabbit. The sound continued, drawing Viana's attention. She bravely thought that she needed to check and headed towards its source. It was very difficult to make our way through the thickets, trying not to get pricked by the sharp thorns. Deep in the thicket, the girl saw something black. She suggested that it could have been a black cat. He was probably in pain and discomfort since he climbed here. Maybe he needed some help. Viana has always been too soft on animals. With great difficulty, the girl overcame all the obstacles and fell out of the bushes. She found herself sitting on her knees on the grass and raised her head to check who was hiding from her. She was surprised by what she saw. What she couldn't imagine was finding a child here. It was completely unclear what this little frightened boy was doing here. Viana leaned over the boy and looked closely into his eyes. His eyes were wide with fear. He also clearly did not understand anything. Viana watched the boy with her arms crossed. She reached out her hands to him and took his cheeks. She looked closely at his face. If you look closely, this child even seemed funny to her. They heard voices, someone asking if the boy had been found. Another replied that he was nowhere to be seen. Those searching asked where this rascal could have disappeared to. They said it was important that he not run into the young lady here. Viana stood up resolutely so that the maids could see her above the bushes and asked what was going on. The maids were clearly frightened by the young lady's appearance, and Viana told them not to make her ask twice. Viana announced that since the Marquise had died, she was now the mistress of this house, and therefore of this garden as well. Viana said that they had entered here without permission, and were now not even answering questions, which should be considered disobedience. The maids exclaimed that they had done wrong and began to ask the young lady for forgiveness. They begged her to show mercy, but even without their excuses, it was clear to Viana that they were looking for this child, who was huddled in fear in the grass. The boy looked at Viana with hope. He reached out specifically to her, because Viana said the maids were too noisy and told them to leave. Viana repeated for them to leave. She said she would inform the head nanny about this, so they needed to be prepared for the conversation. "Well," Viana said as they left. She looked at her find, trying to figure out what to do with the boy now. This boy who was looking at Viana now with bottomless eyes was Lant Baron Eliant. The Marquis brought Lant into the house shortly after the death of the Marquise. When Viana learned that the boy had settled with them, it was no longer news to anyone. Her nanny cried bitterly for several days, repeating about the Marquise's misfortune. Viana hated him with all her heart. Her pride in being her father's only child instantly crumbled to dust. And the worst thing was that, unlike Viana, who barely resembled her father, Lant was his spitting image. While the Marquise and Viana were being pushed into the shadows, some strange puppy languidly entered their lives. How could Viana just accept it? Until the very moment she got to the palace, she turned his life into a real hell. Viana encouraged the maids to spoil his food, and if he did anything that displeased her, she found a reason to beat him black and blue. Nobody tried to stop her. On the contrary, people were deliberately trying to curry favor with her, and therefore mocked Lant. But Lant never resisted. Even when he was beaten with sticks, he did not make a sound. In this small, silent child, Viana saw the Marquis, that same cold, unfeeling man who did not even blink, no matter how much the girl craved his warmth. Viana was a coward back then. Instead of taking her anger out on the Marquis, she took it out on Lant, and the only one who could have stopped her, the Marquis himself, didn't even lift a finger. Lant could only endure every second of this nightmare. Now looking back, Viana realized how strange it was. Lant was the only heir of the Eliant family. The Marquis never spoke about passing on the title, but there was no one else to continue the line. The Eliants had always had problems with offspring. They said the Marquis had a younger brother. But he had died long ago. If so, then all the more reason for the Marquis to recognize Lant as his heir and put an end to the abuse of him. But instead, he hid him in an outbuilding and gave him only the most basic education due to a nobleman. Well, okay, said Viana, looking at the boy. At least this time she hadn't started torturing him yet. She used to hate Lant, but now she didn't even know. Maybe he reminded her of Tarangi, the dog she had when she was Ligia, but for some reason she wanted to tame this boy. Hey you, she said, listen here, if she had been the same, he would not have gotten rid of her so easily, because the maids were ordered to keep the boy away from her. Viana looked at the boy. He didn't show any reaction, and she thought that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. He and the Marquis were just alike. She told the boy that first of all the scratches needed to be treated. Viana couldn't take the boy into her chambers because the nanny was there, and she wanted to treat him without anyone noticing, so there was only one suitable place left. Come on, she said, holding out her hand to the boy. Lant looked at her with a completely confused look. The boy took Viana's hand, not taking his eyes off her. Viana remembered that Lant was about 4 years younger than her. The last time she saw him in his past life, he was already quite tall. He was even taller than the Marquis, with broad shoulders and a strong build. Viana did not know this for sure, but she believed that he was popular with the girls. Who would have thought that this boy would grow up like this? The maids looked for him in the garden. They said that if the butler found out, it might be the end for them. They called Lant a damn boy. Viana didn't understand why the boy avoided the maids like the plague. She herself hadn't even started teasing him yet. But now she heard them calling him a bastard, saying that he would regret it when they caught him, and if the lady found out, it would be even worse. They continued searching the garden, and Vian became curious. Anyone with eyes could see that Lant was the spitting image of the Marquis, but for some reason, the maids treated him like an unwanted stepson. If he had been a bully or a complete loser, Viana might have understood, but he was always quiet and obedient. There was definitely something fishy going on here. Although the heads of this house obviously didn't care what was going on under their roof, so the butler and nanny ran everything here. All the maids were under the personal supervision of the nanny. Viana noticed that only the maids were looking for Lant. The girl thought that she needed to figure out what was going on here as quickly as possible. She led the boy along the porch, surrounded by columns. Viana knocked on the door in front of her. There stood a very surprised butler. "Madam," he said, looking at Viana, behind whom the little boy was hiding. The butler asked if everything was okay, but the girl resolutely walked past him inside. Having seated the boy on the sofa, Viana ordered the butler to bring the necessary medicines. Viana watched him go, wondering what all of this had been. Viana had long wondered where this sudden interest came from and what questions arose. Soon the butler came with a whole medicine chest and handed it to Viana. She examined the scratches from something sharp on Lant's hands. The boy also had a swollen cheek as if from a blow, as if someone had hit him. Damn, Viana thought to herself. It seems it was herself. He had such soft skin and she just squeezed his cheeks a little, that's how it was. Viana said that the boy's skin was probably too sensitive. She told the butler to make sure everything healed properly, and he replied that he would do everything as the lady said. Viana ordered that when the butler finished with the bandage, a cake should be brought to her chambers. She got up from the couch and started walking away, but then she remembered something. "You're coming with me," Viana said to the boy. These words struck the boy. He froze, looking at her. In Viana's room, wonderful cakes and a captivating aroma awaited them, as well as a golden light that made everything a little magical. The astonishment on Lant's face was simply incredible. "Come on, eat," Viana told him. Lant rushed to the table and grabbed the cake with his hands. The boy ate very carelessly, as if he had not been taught any rules at all. That's why he was considered a country bumpkin. Everyone immediately knew where he came from. No one would understand why the lady was bothering with such a child. Okay, Viana herself could do whatever she wanted with Lant, but for some reason, she found it unbearable that others would make fun of him. "Get out," Viana ordered all the maids who were whispering about the boy's bad manners. She asked if they had forgotten how to understand her orders the first time, and if they wanted her to explain with her fists. If words didn't get the point across, Viana was ready to explain them with actions. Lant looked at the cake in his hand. Viana thought that everyone in this house trembled even from one breath, as if someone was constantly intimidating them. All this complicated the situation, because Viana had no intention of getting close to anyone. Although she didn't think one child would make a difference, maybe it was worth punishing them all. Viana could very well do that for Lant if he wanted, but she didn't know what he was thinking. Lant remained silent and said nothing about his desires. Viana didn't understand why he didn't want to punish the maids who made fun of him. She explained to the boy that if someone did something bad, they had to be punished, and to offend Lant here was a serious offense. The boy muttered something, but Viana didn't understand the word and asked again. Bursting into tears, Lant said it hurt. Lant said that when you get punished, it hurts a lot. Viana looked at him in amazement, experiencing emotions that were unusual for her. She rushed towards the boy and hugged him tightly. She said that if Lant was against it, then she would leave them all alone. Viana thought she needed to get things in order quickly. But first she was going to take care of this boy, her boy. Viana told Lant to let out all that he had accumulated. She called him her puppy, thinking that he was the first thing that truly belonged to her in this world. The light came from the windows, which were not covered by curtains. "What is it?" the Marquis asked Viana. She thought that in this life she would not allow Lant to turn into such emotionless ice. Viana told the Marquis that she needed teachers. The butler placed his hand on his chest and reminded her that the young lady already had many tutors, in etiquette, manners, and also in theology, mathematics, and all that. But Viana thought the problem was that they were not meant for her. Viana stated that she needed the best teachers in every field, and the Marquis inquired about the reason for such a need. The girl replied that it was necessary for training. The Marquis asked who it was for, and Viana replied that it was for Lant. The Marquis asked what she was thinking about. Viana explained that she was thinking about exactly that. She said that she needed the best mentors to train Lant. In addition, she asked to fire all her current teachers. She had known everything they taught for a long time. With a smile, Viana said that she hoped that the Marquis would approve her request. She rose from the sofa and asked to be allowed to take her leave. The Marquis detained her, asking why. He wanted to know why she was suddenly showing such interest in this child. Viana replied that it was because he belonged to her. The Marquis could not understand what she meant, and the girl explained that she would not tolerate anyone despising her puppy. She was going to make the best of him. So now she asked the Marquise to help her with this. It was absolutely necessary to make the boy into Marquis Elion. You just had to try. Now Lant was really just a cute puppy, but one day he would become a formidable beast that no one would dare to humiliate. And the Eliant family will be his wings. Viana thought as she walked out the door that this was wonderful. She just couldn't wait for these days. One of the maids appeared behind the door. Viana asked angrily what was the matter, but the maid only wanted to know if the young lady was returning to her room. Yes, Viana answered and quickly walked past her. She saw that the maid's behavior was rather strange. The servants in this house were too wary, as if they were constantly eavesdropping at the doors, and the maids had been behaving very suspiciously lately. Viana ordered Lance's room to be moved from the outbuilding to the main building. Due to the nanny's intervention, she found herself quite far from Viana's own quarters, but for now the girl was willing to put up with it. At least they now lived in the same building. Viana lay in her bed and couldn't fall asleep. Everything was spinning in her head. She got out of bed and thought that it would soon be dawn. Lant was probably sleeping. She was just going to check on her boy and then go straight back to bed. The door to the nanny's room was ajar, and Viana walked up to it. The nanny's room was empty. She was not there. A terrible thought came to Viana's mind. She needed to get to Lant as quickly as possible. The girl started running down the empty, dark corridor. "Do you think you've earned the right to sleep?" she heard from the door of the boy's room. She walked over and peered through the crack between the door panels. The maid surrounded Lance's bed, saying that he had to find out who was laid to rest there, just to enter there, since he was a homeless puppy. They said he should never have set foot in that house. The nanny asked how the boy dared to create problems for their young lady. At that moment, Viana took a decisive step into the room. In a rage, she asked if the woman was completely crazy. Stuttering, the nanny said that everything was not at all as the lady thought, and Viana asked her what she was doing. Viana exclaimed that the nanny had gotten involved with the wrong person. "Butler!" she screamed throughout the big house. Soon the butler ran into the room where he saw Viana and Lant clinging to her. The butler asked what had happened to the young lady. Viana explained that she witnessed a boy being abused here. Ignoring the nanny's indignation, Viana declared that all these people here were real criminals. The nanny said that the young lady could not do this to her. She did not seem to know how the Marchioness died. Lant at this time pressed himself against the girl and looked with frightened eyes from behind her skirt. The nanny asked why the young lady was doing everything for some freak who should have been torn to pieces. The sound of that hate-filled voice made Lant cower in fear. Viana asked the nanny if now was the moment when it was necessary to maintain dignity. Now not only Viana knew about the nanny's actions, the Marquise saw everything too. From the night Viana revealed her true attitude towards Lant, the estate was in a real turmoil. From the testimony of the maids, it became clear that the nanny was behind everything that was happening. But Viana still found it difficult to bear the thought of the severity of the punishment she would be subjected to. Yes, this woman did something unforgivable, but she was the one who raised Viana as if she were her own child. In the end, Viana personally asked the Marquis to let him go. He doubted it, but listened to her and simply removed her from her duties. Before leaving, she threw out one last remark that they would still regret this, and without turning around once, she disappeared. After that, Viana selected reliable people, distributed responsibilities again, and for a while, everything calmed down. As for the nanny, nothing more was heard of her, so now Viana and Lant spent a lot of time together. Lant would come to have breakfast with her or tea in the garden. Viana asked what was wrong with her little puppy. Lant asked if it was true that he was causing trouble for Viana. What Viana exclaimed indignantly. She stroked the boy's head and told him not to think about such nonsense, but he objected that he was told so. Lant said that since he had been here, Viana had felt bad, but she asked if she had ever said that to him. Never, because he was not a burden to her. He just didn't need to listen to empty talk. Viana said that she would do everything so that he would never feel out of place in this house, because he was her little puppy. She told them to forget everything they said and remember only one thing. His sister was his sky, he needed to know nothing more. Viana's slightly altered childhood did not particularly affect the past, the key events remained the same. Just like in her previous life, she was betrothed to the crown prince on the day he came of age. She was still too young, so the first prince's supporters objected, so the wedding was postponed. But Viana was confident about what would happen next. If everything goes as before, she will become a crown princess on her 16th birthday. 4 years had already passed since the Marquise's death, and in 3 months it would be 5, which meant that there was very little time left until Viana's 16th birthday. Last time, the emperor did not hesitate as soon as she reached the required age. He immediately arranged her engagement to the prince. Viana really needed a plan, otherwise everything would happen again. The prince's hand touched the girl's shoulder. "Viana," he said, looking at her. He asked what was wrong with her. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. Viana thought that this man was simply equally kind to everyone. It could not be understood otherwise. He looked at me with concern, and it was difficult to remain calm under the gaze of those eyes. The prince said that this would not do. He would call the court physician. Viana tried to hold his hand. She said that she was fine and there was no need for a doctor. The prince objected that she was pale, but Viana said it was just a slight dizziness that would pass on its own. The prince asked her again if she was sure. The girl replied with a smile that she did, and asked for forgiveness for disturbing his highness. They sat down together at the tea table. Viana thought that no matter how often they met, each meeting was still very difficult for her. The emperor seemed to think that if they spent time together often, they would eventually develop warm feelings for each other, so he arranged dates for them under the guise of tea parties. But the problem was not with Viana, but with the emperor's son. There were probably differences from his past life. In his past life, the prince thought Viana was unbearable. Looking at her reflection in her teacup, she seemed to see a completely different version of herself there, and thought that perhaps the prince was now at least worried about her because she had stopped pestering him. Although none of this mattered, since Viana had no intention of marrying him anyway, 2.5 years had passed since their engagement, and the prince asked her why she had suddenly brought it up. He assumed that he had made a mistake somewhere. Viana replied that it was not the prince's fault at all. He had always treated her with respect, as his bride, if that was what he meant. Then everything was correct. But the prince said that he was not talking about that. He wanted Viana to say if he had offended her in any way. The girl answered that this was not so, and he had not done anything bad. "Then," said the prince, leaning forward, he asked if Viana might simply be uncomfortable with his presence. She didn't know what to answer him to these assumptions. The gaze of golden eyes looked at her from the impenetrable darkness. "Answer, Viana," said the prince. He wanted to know if the girl was uncomfortable with him. Viana really didn't know how best to behave at this moment. If she says yes, will that mean their meetings will stop? "Ha," said the prince, and reminded that Viana was his bride and should understand this. The girl calmly replied that the engagement could be broken off. The prince asked her if she understood what this meant, and she said that she understood perfectly well. He asked if she really intended to break off their engagement. "Yes, your highness," said Viana, and then the prince asked why. Viana replied that she was completely indifferent to his highness. The prince's face darkened and he thought for a while. Then he suddenly laughed. "What an interesting person," he said, laughing, and then added that Viana knew how to surprise. "But I'm not joking," he said, looking the girl in the eyes. He couldn't understand whether she herself was so naive that she spoke of love, or whether she was simply so skilled at pretense. Among the nobility and royal families, it is rare for anyone to marry for love, because marriage is not only a matter between two people, but a union of two houses, a way to strengthen common interests. Viana was born an aristocrat and enjoyed the privileges of nobility, so it made sense to marry for the benefit of her family. Viana thought that if this path led to tragedy, then it was not worth going down it. Life was short, and she did not want to waste it. She pressed her hand to her chest and confessed that she dreamed of meeting her loved one and living happily with him for 100 years. Ligia knew this joy, but the past Viana did not know what happiness was. She asked the prince that it was not at all necessary that she should be next to him. She just wanted to be happy, and she would definitely be. Viana said that this engagement was based on certain conditions. If a suitable lady was found, it would also be beneficial to the prince himself. The prince crossed his arms over his chest and noticed that the girl seemed to not understand something. The prince declared that there was no more suitable lady than Viana. The girl asked if he was so sure about it. They sat opposite each other during this tea party, and the girl thought that she would do everything possible to prevent this wedding. She never cared about other people's opinions and assessments, and now there was no need to try to please His Highness. She didn't need to worry about the impression she was making. It was time to go for broke, so Viana smiled and offered to find a suitable young lady if the prince wanted one. The prince said that okay, let's say, hypothetically, there is someone who is more worthy of this, but he still doesn't understand what then. Viana smiled. She of course understood that then she would simply have to give up this place to someone who would be better. The prince said that they were already engaged and Viana was officially his bride. But, the prince said, and a shadow seemed to pass over his face. He touched Viana's face and said that everything could be solved in a much simpler way. Leaning towards the girl, the prince said that Viana could fall in love with him. The prince kissed Viana on the lips. The girl swung her hand to strike. The prince grabbed her hand by the wrist and did not allow the blow to be delivered. Viana looked the prince in the eyes. He noticed that it was the hunting instinct to pursue fleeing prey, and he had always been a very skilled hunter. He brought the girl's hand to his lips and said that there was no need to provoke him, and then called her his Via. Already in the carriage, Viana grabbed her head. She couldn't understand whether he had really gone completely crazy. Although, if he had agreed to break off the engagement without hesitation, that would have been even more surprising. He hadn't met her yet, and for now he was still benefiting from the terms Viana could offer. But still, the prince's reaction was unexpected for her. He didn't get angry or upset. He looked at Viana like a bird of prey at its target. Viana was angry that she was so overwhelmed by his aura that she couldn't even do anything, because she could at least slap that annoying handsome face or kick him, but he seemed to disarm her. Honestly, going with the flow and not fighting the scenario wasn't such a bad option. Vian didn't really want to fight to change the future. Later, when the prince met his love, Vian could just give her place and go back to her life. It wasn't a bad plan. She wanted to meet someone she would love and be happy with, or find a companion with whom it would be easy, as with a friend, and calmly meet old age. That would also be good. But this won't work, Viana thought decisively. The prince called her prey, but he was wrong to think that only hunters know how to hunt. The prince himself should have been careful. He wouldn't have time to come to his senses before this very prey would be lying in wait for him. When Viana returned to her estate, her maid was waiting for her with a bow. Viana immediately asked her where Lant was, and the maid replied that he was on the training field. She could call him right away. Viana said that she would go to him herself. It was a beautiful sunny day, with light filtering through the thick branches of the trees in the park, as Viana walked through to the training ground. Viana thought about how she had initially been worried about Lant being assigned a retired knight as his mentor. But this man really turned out to be one of the 10 best in the entire empire. His teaching methods were impeccable. Viana knew little about fencing, but now, watching the training match, she thought that if Lant could hold out for so long against an opponent like his mentor, then he was truly talented. The gazes of the mentor and student crossed over the crossed blades. The retired knight smiled at the boy. Blade slid along blade. Both put away their swords and bowed to each other. Viana got their attention by clapping her hands. Lant was very happy to see the girl. "Viona," he called out to her, and she watched him with an indulgent smile. Viana came closer to them and told Sir Tilt that he had done well, and the knight replied with a chuckle that it was his duty, and now he asked permission to take his leave. Lant asked what brought his sister to the training field. Viana pinched his cheek. She reminded him that she had already asked him not to call her sister, and Lant quickly apologized. Viana said angrily that his apology sounded strange, as if he were a gigolo who was seducing older rich ladies. She asked why he thought that because he had grown up a little, he could no longer listen to his sister. "My sister is my sky," Lant replied. He said he hadn't forgotten about it at all. He noticed that Viana was in a very bad mood today, and asked what had happened at the palace. Viana replied that she had been bitten by a mad dog, and a big one at that, something that had never happened before. The words that a mad dog could have appeared from somewhere in the palace shocked Lant. He asked if his sister had been hurt. Viana looked at him tiredly. She walked up to Lant and hugged him. She said that she liked the scent of the warm sun. It made her feel so calm. She wished that nothing else would disturb this peace. "Madam!" a loud voice rang out. "Lady Trouble," Viana heard again. News arrived that Count Pisone was dying. Count Pisan returned exactly 2 months after that day, whether it was coincidence or fate, but it was the same day he died last time. He moved into the residence to be as close to the Elian's house as possible, and traveled back and forth between the houses to see Viona frequently. As if trying to make up for everything he had missed, the Count devoted all his time to Vione, but perhaps the death of the Marquise had an effect on him. His own health remained weak, and those around him were gradually preparing to say goodbye to him. And now it seems this day has come. Viana and the Marquise hurried to arrive at Count Pisone's house. There was a little girl standing near the door, whom Viana called out to, calling her Elle. The girl turned around. She also recognized her. Viana approached her and asked why she was here alone. Elle explained that she wanted to get to her father's room. Viana explained that she shouldn't wander around here alone, and the girl held out her hands to her. Viana hugged her. She didn't understand what she should do now. It would be wrong to go to the Count now, even if Elle couldn't see well. She didn't want the girl to see something like that. "Oh," said the man who opened the door and appeared on the threshold of the room. He said he was glad to meet Milady, but Viana couldn't remember who he was. He called himself Evan Lee. It was Evan Lee Pison. This young man was the heir of Count Pisone. Information about Evan Lee Pison was shrouded in mystery. No one could reveal it. No one knew what country he was from and who his parents were. The Count's family members were suspicious of him and fiercely opposed his becoming heir, but in the end, he still became Count Pison's successor. And from then on, the Count's trading company entered a golden age. The noble ladies vied with each other to boast of the things they had bought from this family. They behaved as if buying these goods was the latest fashion: dresses, shoes, jewelry, basically luxury intended for women. Viana had heard that they sold ladies' goods, but she hadn't expected this look. He was tall with a harmonious build, and his expressive facial features made him look more like a knight. He didn't look like a merchant at all. "Evan," little Elle cried out loudly. He took the girl in his arms and asked with a smile why she had run away from her nanny again. Viana thought that Elle, usually so shy with strangers, was throwing herself into his arms without hesitation. They must have seen each other often. The girl said that she missed her dad. Evan replied that he understood, and Dad missed her very much too, but he was so sick now that they would have to wait for another meeting. And then the girl asked when. Evan replied that when Elle eats well, sleeps soundly, and becomes even more beautiful, but the girl capriciously objected that Elle is already beautiful. Evan agreed that Elle was very beautiful. The door to the room opened slightly. Viana and the Marquise looked in that direction. While Evan continued to distract and calm the girl, Viana and the Marquis entered the Count's chambers. They carefully approached the bed on which the dying man lay. The Countess sat next to the bed, looking only at her husband. "Viana," said the Count, extending his hand in the direction of the guests who had entered. This wasn't the first time Viana had to say goodbye to someone forever. She had experienced this countless times, even as Li Ji. But she didn't understand why the pain didn't get any less each time. "Thank you," said the Count as Viana took his hand. He called her his child and told her to be happy. Then he saw the Marquise and called him by name. "Please," he said, looking into his eyes. After this, the Count's eyes closed. His hand slipped from Viana's. The hand fell limp and lifeless onto the bed. "Grandpa," Viana called out to him. "Darling, wake up," cried the Countess, rushing towards him. "Darling, please," she repeated, her eyes filling with tears. Grief distorted the Countess's features. With sobs, she fell on her knees before the bed and threw herself on the Count's chest. Viana thought that her grandfather, the Count, was the first person from whom she truly felt family love, realizing who she was. His kindness and care broke down even the strong walls that Viana had carefully erected around herself. She knew that her grandfather would leave this world. He lived 4 years longer than expected. Viana had more than enough time to prepare for his death, so everything was okay for now. She repeated to herself again that everything was fine. "What's wrong with you?" asked the Marquis, placing his hands on her shoulders. Viana turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. She rushed towards the Marquis, and he hugged her tightly, supporting her. He said he would stay by her side until her tears dried. The Marquise's unexpected behavior confused Viana. She wanted to stop crying and break free from his embrace. But against her will, tears continued to flow for a very long time. And much later, a scandal awaited. Everyone cries that this was madness, that only someone completely crazy could do this, filled the entire house. The man in black shouted that the company had been given to some scoundrel with an unknown past. These people didn't even show up for the funeral, so Viana couldn't have suspected that things would go this far. Everything turned out to be much worse than the girl expected. Now she sat on the sofa and watched the scene unfold before her eyes. "This is simply unacceptable," these people shouted, pointing at Evan. They asked who this man was to inherit the fortune. "Please calm down," Viana said. But the man in the white shirt asked her how she could remain calm in such a situation, when the heart of the Pison Trading Company was about to end up in the hands of an unknown scoundrel. In short, the Count's inheritance was divided between the 4 main claimants. The Countess and his daughter Elle received the mansion, the lands of the Pison family, as well as enough money and jewelry to live in luxury for the rest of their days. Vianney, as before, received a small plot of land, some money and jewelry, and the most important title was given to Elle's future husband. Up to this point, everything went according to expectations. But what shocked everyone was that both guardianship of Elle and the key trading company passed to Evan. Although Viana herself was surprised by something else. For some reason in the securities he was listed simply as Evan Lee, and not as Evan Lee Pison. Now people were outraged that a man without a drop of Pison blood was inheriting the company. They thought it was unreasonable. Moreover, they did not understand how he could become Ariel's guardian, because it would have been much more natural to choose one of the older members of the family. They wanted to know the Countess's opinion, so that she could have her say whether she agreed to entrust her daughter to this man. But the Countess closed her eyes and said that she trusted Evan. All these people were amazed that she trusted a stranger more than her family members. One of those present shouted that taking into his house some woman of unknown descent was the first mistake. The second man suggested that, come to think of it, Ariel might actually be that bastard's child, which meant they should reconsider the will. At that moment, the cup of tea fell over with a crash and shattered into pieces. Viana said she thought she had misheard. She stood up and stepped on the shards with her foot. She ordered to repeat again what had just been said. Viana repeated that they had just said that her Aunt Ariel was not of the Pisone family, if, of course, Viana had understood all this correctly. The girl asked if this meant that her grandmother had just been accused of cheating. Then she asked who dared to talk about this in her presence. Viana clarified whether she could regard these words as an intentional personal insult. "Oh no!" cried the man who had just uttered them. He fell on his knees before Viana's chair to insist that this was not so at all. He begged her to forgive him. Viana replied that he didn't need to ask her for forgiveness. Looking over his shoulder at the Countess and her companion, the man thought that he would have to ask the Countess for forgiveness. Although this woman held the title of Countess, she was nothing more than a commoner who was lucky enough to marry an aristocrat. The Marquise's daughter would soon become the crown princess and gain power, that was logical, but it was not at all worthy to apologize to this low-born woman right now. He said it was just youthful impulsiveness, my lady just had to understand that. Viana asked if he had called what had just happened just youthful impulsiveness, and she was told that was exactly it, because young people make mistakes. All the people around started talking about what was true. Everyone can make a mistake. The one who never makes mistakes is probably not a human being at all. Viana suggested that her interlocutors think about who they are now talking to, about the mistakes of their youth. And one of the interlocutors replied that, given the age of Milady herself, he was ready to turn a blind eye to her insolence, but nevertheless, there is a limit to everything. He thought that this was no place for a cheeky girl who had not even passed the coming-of-age ceremony. Viana looked at the people gathered in this room very thoughtfully. She asked if she could find out the name of her interlocutor, and he introduced himself as Chris Eslot. "Eslot, speak," Viana said, crossing her arms over her chest. She couldn't remember the name, he said it was all too much. But Viana noticed ominously that he had said that he was the eldest in the house. She thought that at least he had inherited a noble family name, but now she saw that this was not so. She asked how dare those who did not even have the surname Pisone behave so arrogantly. Yes, as everyone correctly noted, Viana was a lady, a descendant of nobility, a true aristocrat, unlike the one who did not even have a middle name. The middle name indicated direct affiliation with a noble family. Viana did not understand why she had to explain such elementary things to everyone here. Viana looked at her interlocutor grinding his teeth and added that he himself should know that he still could not pass on the noble title to his children. Viana was asked if Milady was not too harsh. Despite her youth, no one expected her to be so naive as not to distinguish black from white. Viana admitted that she had been harsh, perhaps unnecessary. But now she has clarified who here, in fact, forgets his place and does whatever he wants. After all, this man did not have a noble family name. There was no middle name either. Viana asked on what basis she considered this man to be the eldest in a noble house. "Milady?" he said, bowing before her. But Viana was merciless. She said that it would be better for him to remain silent. Apparently, he did not inherit the family name of the nobility at all. Viana's green eyes glared at the people gathered in the room. Viana asked if she was mistaken. Someone dared to object that Milady was no better. She also did not inherit the family name. The man who started this scandal said it boldly in the person of Vionnet. But she only smiled proudly, because someone who didn't even know the basics of noble etiquette dared to call himself a member of the Count's house. She asked who should be held responsible for this. The man said that Viana was not giving substantive answers and was just talking nonsense. Chris Eslot asked if my lady wanted him to acknowledge this man, Evan. If Viana had wanted to end it all here, she wouldn't have started. But these people would only drag Elle down, so she asked by what right such words were presented to her. Viana Ossa Eliant, she said. Her middle name, Ossa, was not just a first name but a second surname. Usually, an aristocrat takes her husband's surname, but there are exceptions if there is no heir in the family, or if the head of the family wishes to transfer the rights of inheritance to his daughter. According to imperial law, since a woman cannot head a noble house, the rights pass to her husband or child. But it also happened that there was only one child, and one child cannot inherit two families. Then he receives his father's surname, and the rights of the mother are transmitted through the middle name, Viana Ossa Eliant, in this case a symbol of inheritance, the name of the founder of the family. And now Viana asked the men around her what her middle name, Ossa, meant. Ossa Little Pisson, Viana said with a malicious grin, for that was the name of the founder of the House of Pisson. By right of her name, she drove all these people out of this house. She also stated that they should prepare for accusations of imposture. After the funeral of Viana's grandfather, a week later the girl was supposed to meet the crown prince at the palace. "This is not the road to the wizard's palace, right?" Viana asked. She was told that there was an order from His Highness to deliver the girl to Baharoth. She did not understand for what purpose, but the servant had no right to interpret the thoughts of His Highness. He was only fulfilling the will of his master. Viana did not understand what the one who summoned her to the emperor's palace was thinking. But then they walked to the tea table where not only the prince but also the emperor was waiting for Viana. "Oh!" exclaimed His Majesty and ordered Vion to come in. The girl climbed the stairs and made a respectful curtsy to greet the son of the empire, but the emperor said that he had no need for such prim greetings. He ordered her not to stand on the threshold but to come closer. "Via, come here," the prince said, smiling happily, pulling out a chair for her. Viana sat down on this chair and looked at the prince. She did not understand why he called her here. The prince leaned towards the girl and whispered in her ear that his Via was as beautiful as ever. He put his hand on her shoulder and she turned to look at him. The emperor laughed and exclaimed that he was witnessing a marvelous spectacle, and the man standing behind his shoulder agreed with his majesty. The emperor said that he had heard that the girl had to endure a lot. Viana bowed and said that it was an honor for her to accept his sympathy. The emperor noticed that the girl still acted so formally. The prince said that it was a charming trait of hers. He said that his father could understand. The emperor said that who doesn't know this. He addressed Viana just like his son, calling her Via, and saying that she was upsetting him because she did not want to communicate with him more freely. Viana clasped her hands in her own lap, wishing she knew what exactly he meant by this free communication. The emperor reminded them that they would become one family very soon. He asked whether Vian had turned 16. The girl replied that she was. She understood why the prince had called her here. The emperor wanted to remind her that her coming-of-age ceremony was coming soon. The prince said that it would be in 3 months. Viana thought that since there were only 3 months left, it was time for her to start preparing. Everything was repeating itself again. It looked like her coming-of-age ceremony would turn into a wedding with the crown prince. The emperor asked if the preparations were going smoothly. He was assured that everything was already in progress. There was no need to worry, and Viana realized that all the preparations were taking place in secret. Although, if you remember, even then Viana found out about this only a month before the ceremony. The emperor probably still believed that she did not suspect anything, and even if she knew something, she did not care. And therefore, from now on, she would pretend that she was not aware of the events taking place. Viana looked closely at the emperor and offered him her deepest apologies. She said she would not prepare for the coming-of-age ceremony. "What?" asked the emperor in extreme astonishment. He asked what she meant by this. How could she not prepare for her coming of age? This is the most important day in the life of every citizen of the empire. Even commoners spend it. The emperor exclaimed that the nobility was also making a debut at this ceremony, and if Viana did not introduce herself to society, she would not be able to take her place in society. Viana replied that it had not been 10 days since her grandfather had died. She sincerely could not think about a celebration now. The emperor objected that such a day only happens once in a lifetime. He asked Viana to reconsider her decision. The girl said that even though it was a special day, she did not feel able to organize a celebration, having just lost a loved one. The emperor agreed to drop the conversation about the ceremony and asked what about the social debut. Vian said that she was still too young and had never given receptions. The emperor said that he already knew this. Even though Viana was the second head of House Eliant, she was still not introduced to society. He reminded that one day it was bound to happen anyway. Vian replied that now was not the right time for that. But the emperor declared that it was all nonsense. They would arrange her debut ball immediately. Vian sadly said that she was shocked by His Majesty's generosity, but could not accept it now. This stubbornness angered the emperor. "Why?" he cried angrily. Viana and the prince looked at the emperor. He said that the girl still needed to appear before society. Viana, ignoring the royal rage, replied that she was asking for forgiveness, but she needed time to come to her senses, and she would think about all this when she had dealt with her emotions. When asked when this would happen, the girl replied that perhaps next year, perhaps in the palace, but the emperor exclaimed that it was too late, since it was only the beginning of spring. Viana said that according to the rules, she had 2 years after turning 18, having the ceremony next year was perfectly acceptable. At this point in the conversation, the prince attracted attention with a smile, and then he began to laugh altogether, to which the emperor called him a scoundrel and asked what made him so happy. The prince apologized to his father, the emperor, and said that he believed Via was right, so the emperor asked whose side the prince was on anyway. The prince assured that, of course, he was on the side of his bride. He put his hands on Viana's shoulders. He said that the girl's respect for her grandfather seemed very touching to him, and therefore asked her father to enter into her position. The emperor exclaimed that the prince was already contradicting his father. At this time, the assistant reminded His Majesty that it was time for him to attend a reception with officials. The emperor admitted that this time he would have to retreat. If both the prince and Viana insisted on it, then nothing could be done. Viana was glad that things had turned out this way. Now she had enough time to think it all over again. Viana stood up and walked down the corridor, and the prince followed her. Viana stopped and glanced over her shoulder at the prince. She turned around and asked him how long he intended to follow her. The prince replied with a laugh that it was perfectly natural for a groom to see his bride off as she left the palace. Viana replied that he had never been so polite before. The prince towered over the girl. He was much taller than her. He whispered that he didn't think Via would use the deceased's death as a shield. Viana also whispered back that it was no worse than His Highness using the Emperor as a sword. She admitted that the prince had quite cleverly put pressure on her through the Emperor in her past life. She would have most likely submitted just to avoid unnecessary problems, but the time for inaction had passed. The fire had already flared up and would not stop until it burned everything to the ground. The prince chuckled and said that it looked like Via had put him in his place. It was the first time Viana had seen the crown prince laugh so sincerely. This kind of laughter made the girl feel anxious, as if she had lost. She thought it was best to stay away from people like him, so she turned and walked away. The prince did not let her leave, grabbing her elbow tightly. The prince pulled her too close to him. And yet, it seems, she made it clear that he shouldn't provoke her, but he looked her in the eyes and called her his Via. The girl said she never gave him permission to use her pet name. The prince replied that he never thought that his own bride would deny him the right to call her that, and Viana thought that if she could, she would gladly hit him. But there were too many curious eyes around. These maids were still wiping the same spot on the walls. Although they were standing quite far away from the prince, it was unlikely that the maids could hear their conversation. She believed that as a groom, the prince should show even more courtesy. They stood so close, and Viana's long skirts hid what she was about to do. The girl smiled and said that she had already said that even the prey can sometimes bite the hunter. After this, Viana stepped hard on the prince's foot with her high-heeled shoe. Oh, what a shame, thought the girl, because if she had been wearing stiletto heels, she would have crushed his entire foot. The prince said that it is more complex than one might think. He was still smiling and said that things were really tough with Via. The prince leaned over and kissed the girl on the forehead. Only after this was Viana finally able to leave the palace and head to her own carriage. "Welcome, young lady," the maid said to her with a smile and asked if she was also going straight home today, but Viana said they would go to Via Bibaldi. The maid noted that the mistress looked tired, but Viana replied that everything was fine. Already in the carriage, she began to think about what the crown prince was actually trying to achieve. He kissed her goodbye, and it was unusual. Did he really fall in love with her? Viana could have used something in the story that she shouldn't have. She was sure she had struck, but he didn't look like he was thrown off his game. Quite the opposite. He seemed to be very amused by something. Viana tried to figure out where it all went wrong. The maid called out to the young lady, but she replied that everything was fine. She just needed to be taken to where she said, but the maid said that was not the issue. They were just already on Bibaldi. Still thinking about the trouble that getting involved with the crown prince would bring, Viana stepped out of the carriage and the maid asked her where they were going. Viana replied that Lance's birthday was coming up soon. That's right, now was not the time to think about the crown prince. It was necessary to decide what would please Lant. Suddenly something splashed onto Viana's dress, staining the entire hem red. Viana turned around to see a boy with blue hair fall onto the pavement in front of her. The boy was also covered in this red. He looked and clearly did not know what to say. The maid angrily asked him if he had any idea who this lady in front of him was, but Viana called out to her. Viana said she wanted Maria to stop, although she clearly intended to continue scolding the child. Viana almost turned into a cheap villain from a third-rate comic book. How pathetic she must have looked, shouting about her high status. The stain on the skirt and on the pavement did not look like blood. It must have been paint. The whole scene has already attracted a lot of attention from people on the street. "Ray," Viana suddenly heard and turned towards the voice. The man who said this was known to Vion. He too recognized Lady Eliant. The blue-haired boy called him Guildmaster. Another boy asked him if he was okay. The man who approached them bowed to Vion and asked for forgiveness. "It's been a week, Mr. Evan," Viana said. Everyone was looking at them, so Vion should have changed her clothes first. The blue-haired boy looked at them with wide eyes, surprised that this lady knew the guild leader. It would have been better to prevent all sorts of rumors. They came to a building with large windows. Viana was surprised that this building belonged to the Pisone family. She was not very familiar with their holdings, but the jewelry store was familiar to her. It was her favorite, even when she was empress. They entered, but Evan led Viana somewhere further. She didn't understand where. Viana had been here many times, but she had no idea that there was a door at the back to the third floor. Now the girl was climbing a wide staircase into a room unknown to her. "Lady Eliant," she heard. "Wait here a moment." It was a bright room with 3 large windows through which the sunlight poured, and the room was decorated in white and blue tones. Viana thought something was wrong here. Judging by the store, Evan was going to start a luxury goods business for women. Viana stood there, and for some reason she couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Unlike most of the Pieson family's stores, which bear the family name, Evan's boutiques, which specialize in women's luxury goods, operate under a different name, and he has chosen a new one, Louisia. Louisia was a brand aimed at aristocrats. "You are special," was his slogan. It hit the very core of female vanity. Louise's products emphasized exclusivity, and exclusivity implied high prices. In hindsight, it made no sense, but Evan's marketing was impressive, and could only have come from someone with a deep understanding of female psychology. That is why the reception room was furnished as if it had been decorated by some lady. Here one can feel not a man's taste, but a woman's hand. For all his knightly appearance, Evan turned out to be a much more refined person at heart. "My lady!" Marie's voice rang out. There was a whole collection of dresses on the second floor. Marie said that she stayed a little longer to choose those that would suit the lady especially. Viana crossed her arms over her chest and said that was too much. Marie asked if she should go get another one. Viana asked if the yellow dress was on the second floor. Marie explained that the guild leader said that the mistress could take whatever she wanted. Not only the jewelry, but the dresses were there too. So Evan was preparing Louisia for a relaunch, just like last time. So Viana picked out a dress for herself. It was a sunny yellow outfit with an unusual cut that looked great on her. Marie said that, to be honest, the rest would have suited the lady too. She was sorry that she could not try on more ladies. Viana asked if there were only dresses. Marie said that they were the only ones in that room. She asked what else the lady needed. Viana thought that Evan reviving Louise couldn't be a problem. On the contrary, it would even strengthen the Pisson's trade, and this was only to Viana's advantage. But for some reason she felt uneasy in her soul, as if she had missed something important. Viana decided to try to remember. In those days she spent fabulous sums because of her own vanity. Of course, she could not use state funds for this. She spent her personal savings and the property that came into her residence every year. Although she had inherited a lot from the Marquise and her grandfather, it still wouldn't be enough for all her whims now. And yet, until her very imprisonment, Viana did not feel a lack of anything. Her wealth seemed to be an inexhaustible source. Viana now wondered where all this money came from. Evan entered the room, accompanied by that same blue-haired boy. He was going to ask Lady Eliant for forgiveness again. "Excuse me?" the boy said, looking at Viana with big yellow eyes. Viana wasn't angry about the ruined dress. It was annoying, but not fatal. Yet she couldn't ignore it. The child's careless actions could harm the Pisson's trade in the future. Perhaps Viana was exaggerating, but not by much, because she saw it with her own eyes. Viana noticed the look on Evan's face as he rushed towards the child. It was filled with anxiety. Viana wondered if this was really that important to a man who ran an entire trading enterprise. And the most disgusting thing was that the boy had the same hair color as that person, an unpleasant coincidence. Viana looked at the child more closely. It seemed that his eyes were also exactly the same shade. Viana asked the boy his name. She had heard him called Ray. She asked if he understood what he had done. The boy bowed and said that he was very sorry. Evan stood nearby the whole time, looking at it with concern. Viana wondered out loud what she should do with him now. She smiled. Different thoughts were in her head. Maybe it was worth killing this child. "My lady!" cried Evan in great alarm. The boy, trembling with horror, fell to his knees and looked at the lady. Viana said that even if she finished him off here, no one would dare stop her. And the one he trusts so completely will not become a hindrance to her either. Viana got up from the couch to go over to Ray and sit down on the floor next to him. It was easier to look him in the eye. She said that was where they had made a mistake. Viana looked into the boy's eyes. Tears glistened in his huge golden eyes. "Young lady?" a voice sounded very close. Evan grabbed Viana's hand, pulling her away from the boy. He looked at her with a desperate and worried look. Viana noted that it seemed like they had a lot to discuss with each other. Suddenly, the boy's hand grabbed the hem of Viana's dress. Ray looked at her. He said that it was all because of him, and again asked for forgiveness, because the teacher had nothing to do with it. Everything happened only because of Ray's fault. Viana stroked the boy's head. She noted that this meant that the boy was finally aware of who he was. The Inayari were a people from the western lands of the empire, leading a tribal way of life. These hermits kept so aloof that no one really knew anything about them. But the truth was that Inayari weren't just another country. They were an entirely different species, and their strange, physical features and wild behavior only confirmed this. What attracted the most attention was their cat-like pupils. In their normal state, they were no different from human ones, but as soon as their emotions spilled out, the pupils narrowed into vertical slits, like those of cats. This boy had exactly these kind of eyes, alien eyes. Although he could not possibly be a purebred, he had the skin tone typical of the desert dwellers. But here was the rub. The Empire hated the half-breed Inayari even more, and Viana asked if he understood that. The boy looked at her and his pupils were narrow. Viana said that because of one carelessness, he had endangered not only himself, but also his teacher and the entire merchant guild. She noted that if Ray didn't want those around him to suffer, he'd better be on his guard, because if he relaxed for even a second, it wouldn't just be him who would pay the price. Everyone and everything around him would suddenly be under attack. Tears streamed down the boy's face, but he remained silent. Viana asked him if he thought it was unfair, if he was angry that she had treated him so cruelly over a piece of rag. If so, if it made him angry, then Ray had to become stronger. He had to become so strong that even if they knew who he was, no one would dare raise a hand against him. But if he can't do this, then he must keep his head down and live like a frightened mouse until the end of his days. This is the only way he and his loved ones could stay alive. Viana told Marie to take the child and leave. Viana remained sitting on the couch with an adamant look, and Evan stood next to her. "Now let's hear you out," Viana said. She said that he would answer for his rudeness later. Evan sat down on the couch opposite and said that first of all he had to apologize. He himself didn't know where to start. Viana said that this did not sound like the words of the head of the trade guild in her opinion. A merchant should be able to get out of any situation. Evan replied that this was true, but he was by nature more of a knight than a merchant. The Count always spoke of him as such. Viana was surprised to realize that her grandfather knew what kind of person he was, but still entrusted him with the guild. She wondered what the Count saw in him that was so special that he handed over the business to him. Did he really have an entrepreneurial acumen? Evan looked at the girl and said that she looked very much like the Count. He noticed this even at their first meeting. Viana thought that by the first meeting, he probably meant the day her grandfather died. She tried to understand what kind of look Evan had now. After all, this was not a touching meeting after a long separation. Viana couldn't stand the way he thoughtlessly protected that child. He probably thought Viana was a monster for the way she treated the boy. But then it was unclear why he looked at her with such trust. She told him that it was unexpected. Evan said he understood why my lady thought that way. He thought the way she treated the child was an act on her part, but Viana replied that she was afraid she didn't understand what he was talking about. Everyone understood that Ray was a half-breed in Ayari. One wrong move on his part and the entire guild would be under attack. Half-breeds are considered criminals here, so those who shelter them cannot relax. Evan said Viana just wanted to warn them about it. He believed that she was simply protecting both Ray and himself. Viana replied that nevertheless, the one who understood this danger allowed this scoundrel to wander around with impunity. Evan did not make excuses. He admitted that it was his mistake entirely. Just as I thought, Evan said. He said that my lady really was just like her grandfather. Evan explained that the Count could also scold them so that it would seem like a lot. Evan said he was an orphan, a street scumbag who survived as best he could. And the one who saved Evan was Viana's grandfather, Count Pisson. Without his kindness, Evan wouldn't be standing here, and not only him. The Count pulled dozens, if not hundreds of children out of hell, including that boy. Viana asked if the Count knew who that boy was, and Evan confidently replied that the Count knew everything. So why? Viana asked. Evan replied that the Count called it atonement, but Viana did not understand atonement for whom. The girl looked into the eyes of her interlocutor, but saw nothing in that gaze except her own reflection. Viana seemed to feel her grandfather standing behind her and hugging her shoulders. She thought that her grandfather had spent his whole life atoning for his guilt, saving abandoned children, whom no one paid attention to, for her and the Marquise. Even after he had atoned for his guilt, even after years, the Count did not stop. Viana asked how many more of these children her grandfather had saved, and there were a lot of them. The girl assumed that all of these children were now connected to the Merchant Guild, but Evan said that only some of them. Now Viana understood better why her grandfather had entrusted this matter to Evan. The Count needed a person who would keep his secrets and protect them. Evan was just right for this role. Now Viana understood the reason, but something still didn't add up. Was Evan really the real head of this guild? He seemed reliable, but Viana didn't think that a person with his character could build Louisia from scratch. This means that someone else was behind all this. Evan stood up and headed for the door, Viana watching him go. Evan grabbed the door handle and opened it, as if letting a beam of light into the room. Viana, said the girl who appeared on the threshold. Viana said she didn't expect to see Anasia here at all. The new arrival's shoes began to click on the floor tiles. She walked over and sat down on the couch opposite Viana, with Evan standing next to her. So that's it, Viana finally understood everything. Louis was the pet name she used for Viana's grandfather, and he called her by the pet name Asia. If you combine them, it will be very consonant with the name of the brand that Anasia created. It's stupid that Viana only realized all this now. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and asked how she should understand all this. Anasia asked her not to misunderstand, and Viana clarified what kind of misunderstanding could have occurred. Anasia looked closely at the guest. She handed her a sparkling box. These were the things he had left behind. Anasia said she felt it would be more appropriate for Viana to keep it than for her to keep it. Viana could not understand whether the Countess's expression was pretense, whether she was trying to whitewash herself and take over the trade guild. Even if she had deceived their family, it hardly mattered now. Her grandfather had died peacefully, surrounded by her care, and Viana herself had lost nothing. The box contained rings, earrings, and other jewelry. Anasia said that they belonged to Siona. They were things that Viana's mother used in her youth. Viana replied that she didn't need them. Anasia asked if she still refused to acknowledge Siona as her mother. Viana closed the box and noticed that all this was too intrusive on the part of the Countess. Anasia bit her lip, looking at her interlocutor. She said that she didn't like Viana, and, the girl said, not understanding what she was getting at. Anasia asked how Viana could react so indifferently. Viana didn't understand what the point of all this was. She just wanted to get home and go to bed. The Countess suddenly slammed her palm on the table. She jumped up and exclaimed that Viana would have everything she wanted if she only wanted it, and it was unclear why she had such a detached expression on her face. Viana didn't understand why this woman was behaving like this towards her. Wasn't she supposed to be the one shouting here? She asked what Anasia was trying to tell her. The Countess tried to explain something, but she stuttered and could not finish speaking. Viana was beginning to get tired of this. and she asked her interlocutor to speak more clearly. Anasia asked if Viana wasn't interested in knowing why she was there, but she didn't understand why she should. The Countess noted that this was precisely why she didn't like Viana. She was too indifferent to everything around her, as if she were cut off from this world. She doesn't even care what high society thinks of her. Viana replied that she didn't need to worry about disapproving glances. Just living the way she wanted was already difficult, and adjusting to other people's expectations and standards was completely exhausting. The girl thought that, having lived the life of Ligia, she had already tried to be invisible. Ordinary, gray, there was no point in repeating it again. But she heard the question of whether she could imagine how he had suffered because of her indifference. But Viana did not remember anything like that, no matter how much she wondered if she had really behaved so recklessly as to cause alarm. Yes, she had been acting on her own accord lately, but objectively speaking, she had always been rather reserved. All she did was spend time with Lant at the estate. Anasia sighed and said that it seemed like Viana didn't understand anything. The Countess asked why Viana had recognized Elle's right to inheritance, a question that was somewhat unexpected for the girl. Anasia said that Viana knows that Elle's health is unstable, and by all the rules she cannot be the heir. If Viana, as the bearer of the founder's name, had objected, this will would never have come into force. If that were the case, Viana thought, she would have already spoken out against it when Evan had been declared heir to the earldom in his past life. But there was no need to take the title away from Elle now that the Countess had asked if Viana's half-brother had received a middle name. The girl did not understand what Lant and Elle had to do with this conversation, and the Countess asked if Viana really had no ambitions at all. Viana countered that of course she had them, because everyone except saints had desires of some kind. The Countess did not understand why in that case the girl did not think about taking the titles. After all, she was in a position that allowed her to claim not only the county but also the marquisate. It seemed that Anasia had completely forgotten that Viana was the bride of the crown prince. The Countess asked whether Viana was talking about the status that she herself was trying with all her might to avoid by skipping the coming-of-age ceremony. Viana replied that only the emperor and the crown prince knew that she was not going to hold the ceremony, and she only warned them after she arrived at the palace today. It was unclear how the Countess could have known about all this. Anasia replied that there was no need to stress so much, that was not the main thing. Viana said that for the Countess it might not be, but for her, yes. Anasia's words meant that she had informants in the girl's circle. Anasia assured that she had not been following Vienna at all. It was just that there were always too many ears in the imperial palace. Anasia was simply lucky to have a connection with one person there. She swore by her daughter. Viana noticed that the Countess was very enterprising if she had her own man in the palace. This was a necessary quality to manage such a large trading guild. Anasia asked Viana again for permission to ask her one question. She wanted to know why the girl was trying to give up everything. Viana asked if she was talking about titles. Anasia noticed that it wasn't just about them. Viana was indifferent to everything, be it people or possessions. Titles were just part of it. Anasia wanted to know what family means to a girl. Viana thought about it. If she was honest, she could admit that she didn't attach any special importance to family. Anasia said that when she looks at Viana, she feels like she could disappear at any moment. Viana seemed unaware of how much this was driving her loved ones crazy. Anasia hated her indifference, which she showed even after she received all the attention and love of the Count. It angered her that Viana didn't even try to find out what the Count had gone through for her. And yet, Anasia said excitedly. Viana repeated these words to herself, about how she had not even tried to find out what the Count had gone through for her. She hated her. She wanted to hate her, but she was so grateful to her for giving her Elle. Anasia, Viana thought. She did not approach Count Pisone to take possession of his fortune. She simply wanted to be by his side until the very end. Because Anasia truly loved the Count. Wait then, Viana thought. She looked at Evan, who was still standing silently behind the Countess. It was unclear what the relationship between these two really was. Evan said that Anasia was one of those whom the Count saved. He was their benefactor, like a light that flared up in the darkness of despair. Evan said that for them, who were dragging out a miserable and painful existence, his outstretched hand became a divine salvation. Evan asked if Viana knew why the Count saved him. The young man dropped to one knee in front of the girl. He assured the girl that all this was only for her sake. The Count traveled around the world collecting children, some of whom had outstanding abilities. Among them, Anasia was the most special. Her business acumen was amazing. The Count spared neither time nor money for the training and support of Anasia and the others. When he saw talent, he did not hesitate to put his soul into them. And all this was just for the sake of his granddaughter. Viana had absolutely no idea how it was possible that her grandfather's concern for some other people's children was only for her sake. Evan explained that this company does not belong to him or Anasia. He stated that the trading company is entirely owned by Viana. Viana asked why they were only talking about all this now, and Anasia replied that it was necessary to keep it a secret. This was necessary for the safety of Viana, who was the crown prince's fiancé, and even now his opponents posed a threat to her. If the entire fortune of the Pisson family had passed to Vianney openly, the girl would have been eliminated immediately. Viana didn't understand why Anasia hadn't revealed all this to her in her past life. She needed to think about what had changed in her now. Anasia said she hated Viana because she took away her grandfather's attention, but also called her cute because she looked like him. And later she thanked her for giving her Ella. Ah, thought Viana, now she seems to be beginning to understand. In her past life, the Countess did not tell her the truth because it was her quiet revenge for the dead child. But even so, she did everything to repay her grandfather for his kindness. Viana's wealth, which in her past life seemed inexhaustible, had its source in the trading company Pisson. "I swear on my heart and soul," said Evan, who was still kneeling. It was a vow of eternal devotion to the mistress. Time passed, and the day of meeting with the Crown Prince arrived again. Viana was riding in the carriage and looking at the ring on her finger. It was a ring with fine engraving. All of the Pisson family's trading companies used the Count's family crest, with the exception of one. Only Louisia used a different symbol. The family coat of arms often serves as the seal of the head of the house, and those from noble houses receive a personal seal after coming of age. On her 16th birthday, Viana became the bride of the Crown Prince, and the princess's seal replaced her family seal. However, this ring was made for her by her maternal grandfather. He made it right after Viana was born. He wanted it to be waiting for her by the age of 16. Anasia said that the Count prepared everything for his granddaughter from the first day of her life. For her safety and happiness, he found and trained people who could help her. Anasia and Evan were the ones who went through his school. As a precaution, Louis put Evan in charge of the trade. Anasia assured that she would be Viana's assistant. And Evan will become her knight. Anasia married him to be able to be closer to Viana. So when Viana first mentioned the child, Anasia thought the girl was making fun of her. After all, there was only one moment between them and the Count. He said that he would dedicate his whole life to Viana and asked her to hug him at least once. It was a shameless request, but Anasia was glad that she had decided to do so because, thanks to it, she had her L. The only order they had received from the Count was to protect Viana, and they were going to do everything to fulfill his will. Grandfather had been gentle and kind to Viana for more than 4 years. He had prepared so much for her, and it was unclear why there was this eternal sadness and guilt in his eyes. Even in his past life, he probably did everything possible for his granddaughter. Then and now, Viana realized too late how much he loved her. It was only when that love became impossible to return that Viana realized how much she meant to her. Someone tried to open the carriage door. There was a man standing in front of her who bowed and asked Lady Eliant's forgiveness for being late, but Viana didn't seem to even know him. He introduced himself as Zeke, a servant of the Khyber Palace, which meant that he was a servant of the Empress. Viana did not understand what business he could have with her. The Crown Prince was not present at the moment, and Her Majesty the Empress, fearing that the young lady would come in vain, sent a servant to notify her. Viana thought with irritation that the prince could have at least warned her when he left this was some kind of pointless trip. The servant said that Her Majesty the Empress was expecting Milady. This was unexpected for Viana. Could she really have a reason for this reception, Viana wondered, especially in the absence of the Crown Prince. If this man was really her servant, refusing could create problems, even if she was a puppet. Formally, her status was higher. So, Viana had to follow this servant to the Empress's luxurious chambers. Viana walked into the room where a dark-haired woman in a blue-gray dress sat at a table. Viana came closer. The second person at the table was a golden-eyed blonde, covering her face with a fan. Viana bowed to greet the Empire's moon with a ceremonial curtsy. Then she turned to the second woman sitting at the table. Viana bowed to her as well, greeting the Emperor's first wife. "Welcome," said the woman with golden eyes. The Empress invited Viana to sit down. The woman with golden eyes said that when she heard that the Empress had invited Lady Eliant to her home, she had dared to join, and she hoped that her presence would not be a hindrance. Viana understood that the first Empress clearly did not come for no reason. So it wasn't the Empress who summoned her, it was the First Lady who did it, simply using her name. Viana said that Her Highness the First Empress was speaking the obvious, and she replied that she was glad to see Lady Eliant in full health. Viana decided to immediately ask the Empress why she had invited her. Well, the Empress clearly hesitated with her answer. The First Lady asked if there was a special reason for this. Her Majesty was often bored. Because there was no one her age in the palace, it would be good if the young lady visited her more often. She asked the Empress to confirm her words, and she readily agreed. Viana thought that the inner chambers must be full of concubines and princesses, and she says that the Empress has no peers, and she doesn't even bother to hide this pathetic lie. Moreover, the first Empress, judging by her tone, was accustomed to looking down on the Empress. Viana asked Her Majesty for forgiveness for her rare visits, as well as for her rudeness, but the Empress said that there was nothing to worry about. She was told about Count Pisson. Viana thanked Her Majesty for her concern. Everyone remembered how much noise this incident made. It was said that the young lady had driven out all her relatives. The first Empress smiled. She was like that then, and she was like that now. She hadn't changed at all in this life, or her previous one. Viana saw that. In her past life, she also teased the girl with that saccharine smile. Viana noticed that Her Highness seemed to be showing the keenest interest in the affairs of her house, to which the first Empress remarked that this was quite natural, since they would soon become one family. Viana said she understood that since they were soon to be related, it was indeed appropriate for them to be interested in each other. The first Empress, although she was the eldest daughter of a count's family and already engaged, voluntarily entered the harem as the emperor's concubine. Having given birth to the emperor's first child, she used this as leverage, received the title of the first imperial concubine, and elevated her family, the Moitans, from a county to a marquisate. The first prince was considered the heir apparent until the current crown prince was born, and the first concubine's influence rivaled that of the empress. But everything collapsed when the crown prince appeared. For them, he was like a thorn in the heart, and Viana, in the eyes of this woman, was just another obstacle in the way. And although she did not want to marry him, she also did not intend to lose to this woman. By the way, the first prince's wife still has no children. Viana said that they would soon become a family. She couldn't help but worry about it. After all, she heard that more than 10 years had passed since his wedding. She asked the agitated empress about this, but she hesitated and was unable to say anything. The first prince had one official wife and 3 concubines. He married early, but even now, at over 30, he had no heir, which could not help but darken the life of his mother. This was the weak point of the first concubine. "Thank you for your concern," she said, adding that she had not expected the young lady to be so attentive to detail. Viana said that Her Highness was too kind, but the Empress was clearly too nervous. The first concubine said that it was strange that such absurd rumors were circulating about such a virtuous person. She said that, frankly speaking, she and the Empress were very concerned about the reputation of the young Lady Eliant. Viana thought that the other woman seemed to want her to ask what the rumors were. Perhaps she should play along. She asked what kind of rumors were meant. She learned that it was said that the young Lady Eliant had been embracing a man on the main street, which for the future crown princess was simply an unheard of scandal. The first lady was genuinely concerned about what others would think. It seemed to be about the day Viana met Evan, but they hadn't even touched each other then. Rumors were still an amazing thing, however they sounded quite harmless. It was not clear what all the fuss was about. The first concubine said that this should not be taken lightly because the crown prince and even his majesty might find out about it. The first concubine turned to the empress again for confirmation, and she nodded obediently, agreeing that although the emperor might be angry about this, young Lady Eliant should be much more careful. Viana thought that the words of these 2 women were enough to make any rumor considered true. The first concubine was a great master in this. She knew how to handle rumors better than anyone else. In her past life, she had fallen for this trick again and again. Even now, one wrong move could make danger imminent. In the worst case, her engagement to the crown prince will be broken off due to her depraved behavior. Her current goal was clear, but all rumors were meaningless to Viana now. On the contrary, calling off the engagement even sounded tempting. But if this happens under the stigma of dishonor, it will be difficult to remain in the house of Eliant. It's already difficult for Lant to become a marquis, since he was born out of wedlock, and Vian's presence will only complicate the situation. She can't return to Pisone County either. She's already transferred her inheritance rights to Elle, and her return will be a burden. All that was left for her was the Merchant Guild. In any case, Viana will not be left without a roof over her head. So the broken engagement wasn't such a big deal. However, there was no reason to let this woman get the better of him. So with a kind smile, Viana turned to the first concubine. She reminded her that Her Highness had also once found herself at the center of a scandal. Viana reminded that since the first prince is now about 35 years old, that story took place about 35 years ago. Viana said that they say it was a huge scandal, the groom she was engaged to before she became a concubine. Viana asked if His Majesty had not been angry with Her Highness at the time, for the pregnancy had come soon after she had received the Emperor's favor. Then everything became quiet, because the first prince was incredibly similar to the Emperor, and even the black priests who guarded the purity of the imperial blood recognized him, but a shadow of doubt remained. Viana thought the First Lady hardly expected anyone to remember events that happened 35 years ago. The first concubine looked at her with undisguised hatred. Viana wanted to see how she would get out of this now. The first concubine noticed that the young Lady Eliant was quite fearless. Viana laughed and said that when you are to become empress, you need to be able to manage those below you in status. As the head of the inner court, the girl asked if the interlocutor did not think that this required a certain courage. It seems that there were many in the palace who did not know their place or tried to climb too high. The first concubine said that excessive insolence is not bravery, but recklessness. Viana assured that, depending on who is doing it, recklessness can sometimes pass for strength. "Ha!" said the first concubine. She was touched by these words about strength. By the way, the Empress barely spoke, interfering in their conversation. She reminded that Viana's coming-of-age ceremony was just around the corner. The Empress said she was simply curious to see how the preparations were going. Viana said that she was touched by the care that Her Majesty showed her. The first concubine said that she was also interested in it. Viana replied that there was nothing to cook. Everyone goes through this ceremony. The ladies reminded her that such a day only happens once in a lifetime. The first concubine noted that the ceremony of the young Lady Eliant was a special occasion. The emperor's first wife knew perfectly well that there would be no ceremony at Viana's. Perhaps she was deliberately trying to offend her. "Oh yes, I completely forgot," said the first concubine. She said that the young Lady Eliant had no one to organize this celebration. It was such a shame that a noble lady had to go through the coming-of-age ceremony without proper accompaniment. Viana thought that it seemed like the woman wanted her to say that there would be no ball, that she had no plans to hold one. But now the first favorite continued to insist, and Viana thought about it. She was asked if there really was no one to act as an escort, but even if they went through all of her relatives on her mother's and father's side, they couldn't find a suitable candidate, so the first concubine offered to take on this role if the young lady didn't mind. She asked what everyone would say about it. Viana thought it was a really strong move. The news of the first wife's proposal will quickly spread through social circles after that. No one will dare to become Viana's patroness and go against the first wife. Not a single noble lady will risk incurring her wrath. You could have asked Anasia, even if rumors started spreading. A hand fell on Viana's shoulder and a familiar voice very close by said that it thanked Her Highness for everything. It was the prince. Now it was worth saying that the maternal grandmother had already agreed to be Viana's escort. The prince said that he missed his bride very much. "Crown Prince," exclaimed the Empress, jumping up from her seat. The prince asked to forgive him for this tactlessness. He said that he simply couldn't help but come when he found out that his fiancée was here. The first concubine said that this was too reckless for the Crown Prince of the Empire, and that His Highness should have shown more prudence. The prince replied carelessly that he was at that age when his heart beat faster, and he simply could not be calm as his bride's coming-of-age ceremony approached. The first concubine looked at him with an incomprehensible expression on her face. The prince smiled and kept his eyes on Viana. He put his arm around the girl's waist, lifting her from the chair she was sitting on. Ah, so that's how it is, Viana thought. Perhaps she should have played along with the prince, so she turned to him and asked why he was so late. She said that her wait seemed endless. The prince replied that he simply didn't know she was there. He leaned towards the girl and whispered that if she had come to his palace immediately, he would not have had to wait so long. Viana realized that he thought she wouldn't be able to tell him anything in front of his first wife. She said that Her Majesty herself invited her here today. The prince looked in surprise at Viana, who was hugging him. The girl thought that this was definitely not what he expected from her. The prince said that today was meant exclusively for the two of them. It seems that Her Majesty simply forgot about it. The Empress confirmed that the Crown Prince was right. Nothing should disturb the time granted to them. The first concubine asked whether the Duchess of Garfield would accompany the young Lady Eliant to the ceremony, and the prince confirmed this. Duchess Garfield had lived so secluded in her estate for so long, it was hard to believe that anything had changed. But the prince replied that Lady Eliant would become his grandson's wife. That was enough. "What a relief," said the first concubine. She assumed that the ceremony would take place at the Eliant house. It was a pity that the royal family would not be able to attend it. It seemed that she was not aware of everything. The prince said that His Majesty was already preparing a ceremony for the prince's bride at Urkara Hall, and there was no reason why the first wife could not attend. The first concubine was unpleasantly surprised to hear about Erhar Hall. This was, after all, the largest hall in the entire palace. Intended only for state-level events, it was never set aside for coming-of-age ceremonies. "Ehara Hall for the sake of the Marquise's daughter," cried the first concubine, breaking her fan. She considered this the most flagrant madness. The prince explained that Viana Asa Eliant was not just the Marchioness's daughter, but his fiancée and future crown princess. But the first lady believed that holding such an event without the knowledge of the head of the court was absolutely unacceptable. She again turned to the worried empress for support. When the empress blushed and did not answer, the first concubine repeated her question. The prince declared that this decision belonged to His Majesty the Emperor, and even the empress had no right to challenge it. The empress, in her excitement, again supported what the crown prince was saying. The prince said that with the approval of the Empress and the personal participation of His Majesty in the organization, he advises the Emperor's first wife to avoid the mistake of showing disloyalty. These words caused silent rage in the first favorite. "Then we take our leave," said the prince, drawing Viana away. Together they walked out the door of these chambers. Viana looked at the prince carefully. His face was quite gloomy now. He seemed to be angry. Suddenly the prince came very close to the girl. He suddenly picked up Viana in his arms. She didn't understand what was happening at all. They walked out into the sunlit garden. The prince, with an imperturbable face, continued to carry the girl in his arms. Red with embarrassment, Viana asked how long the prince was going to walk like that. She asked to let her go to the ground. The prince put the girl on the path. As he carried her through the corridors of the palace, all the maids he met looked at them with delighted curiosity. As they walked through the garden, the number of curious eyes only increased. Viana couldn't believe that everyone had caught her in the arms of a man. A shadow passed over the prince's face. He asked why Viana had come to the palace. "Sorry," said the girl, looking at the prince. The prince asked if she had not received his message asking her not to come. Viana replied that she had not received it, and asked if that had caused any problems. The prince said that it seemed that the first empress had begun to act. He explained that he meant that someone had helped to prevent the prince's letter from reaching its addressee, and Viana asked if he meant that it was the first empress. Only a few knew that the prince was not in the palace today, so it wasn't hard to guess who was behind this. Viana realized that the crown prince had rushed to her as soon as he learned of her arrival, which could mean that he was worried about her. The prince said that in any case there was nothing to be done now. Viana would have to make concessions. This puzzled the girl. The prince announced that her coming-of-age ceremony would take place. He told her not to even dare tell him otherwise. Viana cried out that he had lied to the first empress. The prince said that it was Via's coming of age. He wouldn't spend it without her permission. The girl exclaimed that it was still such a blatant lie. She didn't understand how he was going to cope with it. "This is not a lie," the prince said confidently. He explained that His Majesty was indeed going to hold the ceremony at Urkarak Hall, and Viana realized that this meant that she would have to go through the wedding ceremony again. The prince said that he had already told his Via that nothing would happen without her consent. He knew that she had doubts about the ceremony, or rather about marrying him. He suggested that they both compromise. If the girl would give in to him a little, then he would also meet her halfway. Viana asked if she agreed to the ceremony. What would His Highness offer her in return? And the prince promised to fulfill her wish. Viana then asked to break off their engagement, but the prince exclaimed that it was impossible. He asked her to choose something more realistic. Then he would do everything in his power, but Viana wanted nothing more than to break off the engagement. The prince admitted that he was giving in. He said that if they could not break off the engagement, they would at least postpone the wedding day. It was already a victory for Viana. She smiled and said that it was good. They would take a step back on both sides. The prince looked at her, and Viana asked what else he wanted to ask her. The prince noticed that Via was a rather strange person, but she considered herself quite ordinary. The prince had something else to tell her, but now was not the time for it. He suggested moving on, and also asked the girl to try to avoid meetings with the first empress. He said that she was like a viper, and Viana was not yet able to deal with her. Viana said that she was only the daughter of a marquis and had no power to refuse such invitations. The prince chuckled at how modest his bride was. He leaned very close to her so that he could whisper in her ear. The prince said that Viana had done a great job with the first empress this time. Viana guessed that he had heard everything, and the prince remarked that watching the verbal battle was one of the most fascinating spectacles in the world for him. He whispered that they shouldn't interfere with the game before it started. Viana wanted to step on the prince's foot with her heel again, but this time she didn't succeed. The prince laughed and said that he would not fall for this trick of hers again. Then Viana simply kicked him in the knee, and he didn't have time to dodge it. The prince clutched the injured area and bent over in pain. "Me too," Viana told him. She smiled and said that she also doesn't use the same trick twice. In the end, Vianette was unable to avoid the coming-of-age ceremony, since the palace took care of all the preparations, and she only had to complete the rest. Anasia saw this as an opportunity and decided to use it to promote Louise. It was different from Viana's previous incarnation, but she thought the idea was a good one and agreed. As expected, Louisia's production was top-notch. Seeing Viana in a new dress, Lant exclaimed that his sister looked simply stunning, and the girl was indignant that he called her that word again. Anasia asked Viana how she liked the work of the Louisian masters. The countess brought the girl some kind of box. It was a coming-of-age gift from her and Evan. They thought the jewelry would be perfect for her ceremony and had everything specially prepared. Evan was very disappointed that he couldn't give the gift in person. Looking in the mirror, Viana thought the jewelry looked like it had originally been part of the dress. She was glad she decided to feature Louisia at her ceremony. She loved it, and Anasia said she was sure the decorations would match. Viona asked if Anasia was promoting the company through this ceremony, then Viona would surely receive an award, and the countess laughed and replied that Viona was insatiable because everything in the trading company already belonged to her. Viana declared that she was even more insatiable than the countess thought of her. Even if she had all the money in the world, she would still thirst for more. "So try your best," Viana said. Lant bowed to his sister and said that he too would very much like to go to her ceremony. "Wait 4 more years, Viana said, placing her hand on his head. She noted that even if he ran away, saying that he didn't want anything, she would still bring him to this ball. "But Viana," the countess said hesitantly. She wanted to clarify whether she was really allowed to come to the coming-of-age ceremony. Viana remembered that in her past life, the countess was not present at her ceremony, because even though she was called a countess, she was essentially a woman from a simple family. But now everything was different, and so she replied that the answer was obvious. High society is usually very conservative, so it was not surprising that Anasia was hesitant to enter it with Viana. The young countess looked very upset. She stood with her head down. Viana asked how Anasia perceived her. The countess answered hesitantly that she probably thought they were family. Viana said that Anasia should forgive her. She said she could never consider her family. This upset the countess even more. Viana added that Anasia is more of a friend to her. She explained that it would be quite natural for her friend to attend her coming-of-age party. Viana smiled and told Anasia to keep her head up. They would see each other in the banquet hall. Lant continued to look at his sister with an expressive gaze. As Viana walked down the corridor, the young man caught up with her at a quick pace. He took her hand in a delicate lace glove. Viana turned and looked at Lant. The young man said that he loved his sweet sister very much. "I love you too," said Viana. But she reminded him that it was time for him to stop calling her sister. Lant didn't like that she wouldn't let him call her that. They walked out of the mansion. It was a beautiful, clear day, with a transparent azure sky and snow-white clouds. Viana and Lant stopped together in front of the man who was waiting for them in the courtyard. In front of the carriage stood the Marquis in full palace dress. He was the first to get into the carriage. Viana followed him. Lant helped the girl into the carriage and wished her a safe journey with a smile. They sat opposite each other with the Marquis. Viana looked up and thought she had noticed this for a long time. Every time she was alone with the Marquis, the atmosphere became strangely tense. If she had known that this would happen again, she would have asked Anasia to go with them. The Marquis looked at her with a very strange look. Viana didn't understand what she saw in his blue eyes. Soon they arrived at the courtyard of the Imperial Palace. The Marquis climbed out of the carriage with his head bowed. Then he turned and extended his hand to Viana to help her out of the carriage. The girl wondered if the Marquis had always been so gentle. She remembered that he always observed the basic rules of etiquette. Apparently, all this was his way of showing his concern. Viana leaned on the Marquis's arm and stepped out of the carriage. The Marquis held her hand in his. The girl asked if he wanted to tell her something, but he continued to hold her silently. Then the girl asked him to let go of her hand if he didn't want to tell her anything. "Today," said the Marquis, clearly having difficulty choosing the right words. "You are incredibly beautiful today," he said finally. Viana couldn't believe that she was hearing this from the Marquis. She had already noticed more than once that his attitude towards her had changed. At some point, he began having regular dinners with her and Lant when he wasn't busy, and he even entrusted Viana with complete control over the internal affairs of the Eliant estate. Now she would like to know why and when he changed, when it started. Perhaps it started from the very day he comforted her at the funeral. The girl had not yet fully realized all this, but such changes did not seem bad to her, even these timid, paternal feelings. Viana said with a smile that today was her coming-of-age day. Of course she would look perfect. She thought that everything would be fine, but the Marquis's face clearly showed excitement and surprise. Then he finally smiled. "Yes," he said, still holding Viana's hand in his. The coming-of-age ceremony was held in Erhara Hall, as was proper for a lady of the Eliant house. It was known that the Duchess of Garfield would be her escort. Many were expecting a surprise engagement today. The doors were still closed, just like last time. A man in a black suit stood next to them, and then the doors swung open, and an unbearably bright light seemed to pour out of them. Eventually, Viana came back again. On the day of her coming of age, she entered Erkarak Hall with the Marquis. They walked slowly through the hall, and the eyes of high society were riveted on them. The ladies whispered that they wanted to know which boutique had made this dress, because it was so elegant and sophisticated. Viana loved to hear that her dress was the most delightful the ladies had ever seen. Suddenly the girl heard footsteps approaching her. "Via," she heard and turned over her shoulder. The prince approached her and looked at her with a slight smile. "Greetings to the little son of the Empire," Viana said, curtsying. The prince took Viana's hand in his and said that Via was truly dazzling. He kissed the girl's hand, repeating that she was again the most beautiful of all today. Viana saw that everyone's attention was riveted on this scene. She thought that the prince was acting even more assertively because of the many watching eyes. The prince asked if he could have the honor of the first dance with his bride. Viana thought that if she didn't have the first dance with her fiancé, strange rumors might start to spread. It seemed she had no choice. After all, it was only one dance. She could not help but accept the prince's hand and this proposal. They whirled around the room in this dance. Come to think of it, this was actually Viana's first coming-of-age ceremony, which in her past life had turned into the crown prince's wedding. "Via, what are you thinking about so deeply?" the prince asked her. He whispered to her to focus only on him. Viana tried to guess what the crown prince wanted from her. She told him that it was her coming-of-age celebration. She had so many people to greet. But the prince replied that he hoped that the girl had finally developed warm feelings for him. Viana said she had no such intentions. The prince asked if she had thought about it even for a moment. Viana was thinking, but she couldn't communicate her thoughts to him. Once the prince meets her, his heart will change. Viana said it wasn't worth thinking about. The prince's golden eyes followed the expression on her face. He said she was truly unbearable. And then he repeated that she was absolutely unbearable. Viana knew she shouldn't have behaved that way. She had to pull herself together because she remembered what would happen as soon as the crown prince met that girl. And, by the way, she, the one who is connected with the crown prince, will also celebrate her coming of age this year. But even so, Viana looked the prince in the eyes. And he said that everything he said today about her beauty was the pure truth. Viana looked at him without taking her eyes off him. She wondered if he had always been like this, or if something had changed. Perhaps she was once again, without realizing it, craving the prince's attention. This could not go on any longer. Duke Disha and his daughter will arrive in the capital in 2 years. By any means necessary, Vian needed to first obtain all the information. Evan gave her the data, but it was much less than either of them expected. Evan informed her that almost nothing was known about the West. He asked that Viana give him a little more time, then he could send people for more detailed information. Viana wondered if there was no way to find out about it here, but Evan said he was very sorry. It was hard to find Westerners, so information was extremely limited. Some Western lands border the Inayari, and usually the people of such places move to other regions, but Western families are extremely reluctant to leave their homes. Evan was sure that without a personal foray there, they would not be able to find out more. Maybe somewhere it was possible, but when it came to the Daisha estate, everything was much more complicated. Viana herself knew that this issue was very sensitive even for the imperial palace. Evan was truly sorry that he had failed so badly in completing the task, but Viana understood that it was not his fault that her task had turned out to be too difficult. Even in the information Evan had collected about the West, there was almost nothing, and about the House of Dish, which was what she was really interested in, nothing was known at all. Viana thought that perhaps it was meant to be this way. The current Duke of Daisha had been living in seclusion for a long time. Duke Daisha was an unfortunate prince who never became emperor, although he was very close to it. His father was the eldest son of the late emperor and the crown prince. He was successful in both civil and military affairs, but unlike other princes, he had no heirs. Then, as if by miracle, the crown princess became pregnant. The former emperor was overjoyed and held a grand celebration throughout the country, but the happiness did not last long. Before the crown princess gave birth, the heir died after falling from a horse, and the elderly emperor, shocked by the death of his eldest son, fell ill and soon died. Just before his death, he bestowed upon his unborn grandson the surname of Daisha instead of the dynastic one and the title of duke, and there was wisdom in this decision. After the death of the emperor, a bloody struggle for the throne began. The winner, the current emperor, destroyed all his relatives, leaving no one alive except the duke, who could not claim the throne. He was never officially listed in the dynasty's lists, so he was not considered part of the family, which is why he survived. But the blood flowing in his veins was, without a doubt, royal. That is why he was nicknamed the Unfortunate Prince. Exiled to the Western lands even before his birth, Duke Daisha never returned to the capital. The first time he left his lands was when he brought his daughter to her first ball. Even though almost no one knew what he looked like, everything was clear at first glance. He had golden eyes, the symbol of the dynasty, like a true heir. His daughter, the same age as Viana, walked next to him. She was so beautiful that even Viana, a woman, had to admit it. Her long hair flowed softly, and her slender silhouette seemed airy. The innocent face awakened in men a desire to protect, and a bright, serene smile lit up his face. Everything about her was so unlike Viana that she immediately disliked her. Her habit of shedding tears at any careless word irritated and disgusted her. Such was she, Irensville Daisha, the one who already lived in the prince's heart, and who was destined to occupy it again. Lady Eliant, Viana heard. Evan asked if she was feeling unwell. He suggested calling a doctor, but Viana replied that it was just a migraine, something that happened sometimes, but it wasn't serious enough to bother a doctor. As soon as Vian thought about this woman, she immediately lost her composure. To avoid marrying the crown prince, she needed to either bring Irenes to the capital before the ceremony, or postpone the wedding until she arrived, but both options were not so easy to implement. Viana thought that even if it was risky, she had to get some information first. She told Evan to send people west. It was necessary to gather everything that could be learned about the Duchy of Daisha, especially about the Duke's daughter. Wait a minute, Evan said. He informed her that what his lady had asked for the previous time was already ready. He was going to bring it now and asked her to wait for him here. Okay, Viana replied, thinking that this was about the gift for Lant that she had asked him to prepare. While Evan was away, Viana thought she could get some rest. As soon as she closed her eyes, the girl felt someone's presence. It was a boy with blue hair. It seemed like it was the same boy, but it was unclear what he was doing there. The boy bowed and asked for forgiveness for what happened during their last meeting, for it was the first time he met a person from the upper class. Viana said that he should be more careful in future. Not all aristocrats were so lenient. She said that if the boy was finished, he should leave, because she did not give permission to enter this room. Please teach me to become stronger, the boy suddenly cried. Viana frowned as she looked at him. The boy said that he had to protect Viana, but the girl didn't understand what he meant and who he was going to protect. The boy repeated that he wanted to protect Viana, and to do that he needed to be strong, so he begged the lady to help him. The girl asked him if he knew who Viana was, and he replied that of course he did. He saw her that time when she came with Aunt Anasia, and she was so sweet. Viana assumed that there might have been a child with the same name as hers, but she couldn't remember any. The boy said that no one told him anything. He just figured it out himself right away. This was the very one his grandfather had told him to protect, and Viana thought that, judging by these words, he had personally met her maternal grandfather. The boy added that his grandfather said that Viana was sick, which surprised the girl. The boy explained that his grandfather said that Viana was weak and had a wound in her heart, so they had to protect her. The girl couldn't believe that he said exactly that. The boy repeated that he had to be strong to protect Viana, and she wondered if she had always been fragile and vulnerable to her grandfather, since he had ordered even this little one to protect her. She asked why the boy came to her with his requests and not to Evan, if he wanted to be strong so much, but the boy replied that it was because his sister was the strongest. He believed that even Evan couldn't resist her, which meant she was stronger than everyone. Viana chuckled. It seemed this little one already knew the hierarchy. She asked his name, and he replied that his name was Ray. Okay, Ray, Viana said. Let's say it was true and she really was the strongest. She asked why on earth she should teach him. The boy looked at her, and she realized that he hadn't even thought about it. He was still too young for his word to have any weight. He stated that she would help him because she also had to protect Viana. This surprised the girl, and Ray explained that she was also from their caravan. He firmly stated that everyone in the caravan must protect Viana. The girl asked if this meant that she should protect her too, and Ray replied that it did. Viana agreed that he was not mistaken about that. She also needed to protect herself, but she had the feeling that she was getting into some kind of adventure. She asked what exactly Ray wanted to become stronger in, because if he dreamed of becoming a knight or a merchant, then it would still be better for him to turn to Evan or Anasia. Ray replied that he wanted to become an aristocrat because nobles were the strongest. Viana chuckled and noted that for a half-breed Inayari, wanting to become an aristocrat, and even expressed seriously, sounded very funny. But in response to this, Ray shouted that he was not an Inayari. Viana asked how he could deny it with those eyes. It was just funny. This boy didn't even know who Viana really was, but he already dreamed of becoming strong for her sake. Normally she wouldn't even listen to this, but now she was curious to see how far he could go. Okay, she said, looking into the Inayari's eyes, which he tried unsuccessfully to cover with his hands. Viana agreed to help this boy become an aristocrat if he could prove himself worthy of it. She asked him if he had ever heard of Rochester Academy. It was the most prestigious educational institution on the entire continent. There they teach fencing, diplomacy, politics, medicine, and much more, but Ray understood that he would not be able to enter such a place as a commoner. Viana explained that other academies looked at background, while Rochester only required basic education and fees. Even commoners could enroll there, which meant Ray could too. But, Viana said, touching the tip of the boy's nose with her finger. In fact, only a few commoners enter Rochester Academy. Their basic education was the level that children of nobles receive from private tutors from an early age, and the tuition is so high that even small landed gentry find it difficult to afford it. Even if you get in, to graduate you need to pass a lot of difficult exams. If you don't finish in 7 years, you'll be expelled. You should keep this in mind. Viana said that if such conditions seemed too harsh, Ray could refuse. The boy clenched his fists resolutely. He asked if he successfully graduated from this academy. Would it make him an aristocrat? Yes, Viana answered, and the boy declared that he agreed. Then she promised to prepare everything for his admission to the academy. But during his training, he will have to carefully hide his true identity. No one should know who he really is. From the moment Ray steps into the academy, he will no longer be associated with the trading house. Even if he was exposed, the clan must not suffer. Ray would have to sever all ties with the place that meant everything to him. Viana asked if the boy was sure he agreed to this. Yes, Ray replied. He would definitely become an aristocrat to protect Viana. The girl smiled when she heard these words. Well, she said she was very curious to know who this child was talking about. But perhaps she will ask about it when he achieves his goals. At that moment, Evan came in. He brought some kind of box. Hey you, the boy heard and turned around with a sigh. You little rascal, Evan exclaimed. Ray realized it was time to run and rushed away. While Evan asked the lady for forgiveness, it was his fault that he did not raise the boy properly. Viana replied that everything was fine. What was more important was what was in the box. She asked if it was what she asked for. Evan said the lady needed to see. In the box, there was a medallion with an embossed image of a wolf. It was beautiful. Although it was belated, Viana hoped that Lant would like this birthday present. Viana closed the box, and Evan offered to walk her home. The girl replied that this was not necessary, just let them prepare a carriage for her. Evan asked if he was causing the lady any inconvenience. She didn't understand why he was even asking about it. I am your knight, Evan said, his purpose and duty being to protect his lady. Viana knew he was trying to keep the oath he had taken to her as a knight, but she asked him not to overdo it. There was no need to be a prisoner of the promise Evan had once made to her grandfather. She thought that Evan was such an honest man. He would most likely try his best to fulfill the Count's request and the oath to Vion, so she should at least ease his burden a little. She said she was sure her grandfather would understand and walked away. Evan's hand blocked her path and stopped her. Evan said that initially he was just carrying out the Count's will. He asked the lady if she knew when he first saw her. Viana thought it was the day her grandfather died. But Evan replied that this was not the case. One day he accompanied the Count to the Eliant's house. It was for the funeral of the Marquise. Viana remembered the young man who had supported her grandfather so much back then. Evan said that among all these whispering people, Viana stood proudly, and this made a strong impression on Evan. He immediately understood that this was the girl he had to protect. He wanted to protect her, the girl who stood alone among those who did not even hide their anger. It was not about the Count's request, but about Evan's own will. He asked the lady for permission to fulfill the oath he had made as a child. Viana always thought that Evan was only protecting her because her grandfather ordered it, but it turned out that he always sincerely wanted to become her knight. Viana said that if he chose this path himself, she would not refuse. She will accept his oath with gratitude. He will be her knight, Evan Lee. They went down into the yard. Evan apologized. Perhaps his mistress would have to wait a little. At such a time, it was not very easy to prepare the carriage. Viana noticed with a smile that the head of the merchant clan never stopped apologizing whenever he saw her. "Oh, I'm sorry," Evan responded. This made her laugh, and her knight looked at her with dismay. Suddenly, I remembered Anasia's words about how Evan is usually so cold and dispassionate that it seems like he is not a person, but a mechanism. But next to Viona, he becomes completely different. His main concern is always to ensure her safety. It was not just that he grabbed Viana roughly when he met Ray. He was afraid that the girl would be frightened by his eyes. Most people freeze in horror when they see the Inayari's gaze. Viana really was so scared when she first saw those eyes that she couldn't even scream. These pupils, narrowed into a vertical line, these scarlet eyes. Suddenly Viana grabbed her head. She let go of the box and it fell onto the pavement. "Madam!" Evan cried out in alarm. In her past life, Viana only moved between the Eliant household and the imperial palace, not noticing anyone except the crown prince. She didn't understand how she could see the Inayari. There seemed to be a gap in her memory. It was not a natural oblivion, as if someone had deliberately cut out this fragment, and she did not remember anything. Evan hugged her and offered to call a doctor. He said that this was not right, and that he would apologize properly for his rudeness later. But now he picked up Viana in his arms.